second day of, I'll start again, seeing the recording buttons on. I was a bit quick off the mark. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of Hearing 22 infrastructure. We've had a pretty busy and full-on day yesterday, and we're looking forward to that continuing today. And our first submitter is Mr. Britt from the Association of Radio Transmitted. So are you there, Mr. Britt?
I'm not Mr. Britt, I'm Mr. Burt, B-I-R-T.
Oh, my apologies. My sheet has you down as Mr. Britt, but I'll change that. Sorry, Mr. Britt, Mr. Bird. I'm sorry.
My son is a school teacher, and everyone calls him Britt, and he says, I am Bert as in shirt, not Brit as in shit.
I hope he's taught them a few more things than that, but we'll see.
It's a common mistake is what I'm saying. I don't know why people make mistakes. It's only happened in the last couple of years. Anyway.
Yeah, but anyway, my apologies. And welcome. We have read your submission, so you don't need to, and we say this to everybody, you don't need to read out what you previously submitted word for word. We're keen to hear what the issue is from your point of view, and more importantly, what it is you want us to do about it. So just in your own time, when you're ready, fire away, please.
Okay, well, I do have something prepared to say. Firstly, we are very, very happy with the way Waikato Council has responded to our requests. We support all the Section 42A recommendations, but we do have a couple of suggestions to make which may benefit Council in the long run. But I'll deal with those next. Firstly, I want to restate the fundamental reason for the existence of amateur radio. Radio waves do not observe national boundaries. They need to be controlled internationally. So the United Nations has set up a subsidiary organization called the International Telecommunications Union, which in turn convenes the World Administrative Radio Conference every 5 years for all the players to come together to vie for and allocate the limited spectrum resource. The players include nearly every government, their military forces, all major telecommunications authorities, a wide spectrum of commercial developers, all of whom are vying for specific segments of the spectrum. The commercial enterprises can make billions of dollars from the services they can sell with that spectrum. So they're willing to pay millions of dollars for the spectrum. The most ferocious horse trading auctions would be tame by comparison. But despite all that, the World Administrative Radio Conference recognizes that there has to be some spectrum set aside for experimentation and development. This spectrum has to be free from commercial interests. As a result, and by consensus agreement, in other words, all the parties agree, there is a group of spectrum set aside at no cost to anyone, and this group of spectrum is allocated to radio amateurs. They are recognized as the experimental body that has produced most of the developments in radio technology over the last 100 years, and we are continuing to do so. Radio amateurs are licensed under international law and national law. So what I would say is, in making any decisions about amateur radio configurations, therefore, I exhort you to keep in mind that we are dealing with a legitimate experimental science which has a number of amenity values in its own right, and not to be tempted to place amateur radio into a category where it shares relevance with hobbies. Hobbies include collecting salt cellars from all over the world, collecting garden gnomes, and even establishing very, very elaborate model railway systems. These sorts of activities can produce some very impressive results, but they produce no tangible benefit to society. On the other hand, there are many amateur activities which Council supports at great cost to the community, such as sports fields and theatres for amateur dramatics. Amateur radio is a national activity for which we do not seek any Council funding at all, only the permission to use our own residential sections to pursue an experimental science for which we have an avocation. And as I said at the beginning, we are very impressed with the way Waikato Council has over the years continued to provide for that international priority at a local level. The two things I wanted to specifically mention are submission point 549.3 regarding heights stipulated in the different rules. When I first read the proposed plan, I was somewhat confused by the variety of heights defined. The Section 42A report explained these, and I accept that explanation as reasonable. However, think about it further, I would wonder where it would lead to in the future. Good planners have a history of getting promoted to other places, and new junior planners are promoted into those vacancies. I believe that would benefit both the junior planners and the future radio amateurs who are trying to comply with your rules if there was an explanatory note in the district plan accompanying the rules to prevent any similar misunderstanding in future. And the last point is submission point 594.1 definitions. In keeping with the international law, and in order for council to distinguish between enthusiasts or even cowboys and the real internationally licensed experimenters, I would recommend that once again that the definition of amateur radio configurations be included in the Waikato District Plan. The definition requested was amateur radio configurations are aerials, antennas, and associated support structures which are owned and operated by licensed amateur radio operators. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Burt. Let's see if there are any questions. We'll just see if the panel has any questions. I think that's pretty clear, but let's just see. Mr. Fulton, any questions?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
That's good.
No, thanks, Mr. Burt, for submission.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Cooney?
Thank you. I enjoyed your submission. Thank you.
And I have no questions, Mr. Burt. That's very clear. Thank you very much. And it's good to see that the degree of difference that you might have originally thought has mostly been resolved. So that's good to hear. So thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you. Do I go?
You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to go. Just whatever suits you. There's certainly no obligation on you to stay.
I will stay for a while and observe then. Thank you.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just turning your sound off. That way we don't get feedback from rooms and stuff, which you've just done. So thank you for that. And that brings us to our next submitter, which is Counties Power, please. Mr. Mayala. And I hope I pronounced your name right, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Yes, you did. So my full name is Shravan Miryala. And good morning to the commissioners as well.
Morning.
Just to be clear, I just want to make it clear that I was not involved in the preparation of the submissions made to the proposed Waikato District Plan by Counties Power Limited. And today with me are Rachel Bilv, who's the Land Access Coordinator, and Adrian Nadan, Network Development Manager at CPL. Both of whom are happy to answer any specific technical questions.
All right, thank you for that.
Cool. Mr. Chair, I would like to make minor corrections in paras 11, 19, 28, and 38 by removing references to Rule 1451P1 and replacing with Rule 1451P3 just in para 38. I would like to discuss three themes this morning. First, the overhead electricity distribution lines, followed by subdivision in proximity to distribution lines. And if time permits, I would like to discuss size of ancillary buildings.
All right, thank you.
In terms of the overhead distribution lines, CPL sought to amend some of the rules proposed to enable overhead distribution lines in other zones apart from rural and identified areas. Mr. Mackey has rejected the submission points and states that maintenance and enhancement of amenity values, protection of identified areas, and resilience of infrastructure are the primary three reasons why he considered that overhead distribution lines and support structures need to be undergrounded. I agree that overhead lines should require a consent in identified areas and address any relevant issues depending on the context. In terms of the distribution line themselves, they meet the definition of regionally significant infrastructure in the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. Just in terms of addressing some of the concerns raised by Mr. Mackey, firstly, maintenance and enhancement of amenity values. I think it comes down to the density of human population in the receiving environment. As the population density and visual clutter is less in rural areas, overhead distribution lines are a permitted activity and are either restricted discretionary or fully discretionary in other zones. and in identified areas respectively. Just looking at new subdivisions in urban areas, most subdivisions do incorporate underground power cables as space or area for ducting is provided for in the subdivision layout within roads and as required by the relevant territorial authorities' engineering standards. There may be instances where the overhead lines are required for temporary duration until the subdivision layout and demand is ascertained to avoid rework, primarily in industrial areas. Just further along in terms of the amenity within industrial areas, usually the level of amenity that is anticipated is low, and so is the population density. The village and the rural lifestyle zone, previously known as the country living zone, are characterized as semi-rural and rural environments, respectively, with low density. In the existing urban areas, it may be difficult to underground new power cables for any of the following reasons. It could be there is no accurate as-built data, no space within the road reserve, and high costs associated with open trenching the road and rebuilding it in comparison to the overhead lines. Therefore, it is practical and cost-effective to incorporate permitted activity standards in existing and established urban areas, such as industrial zones. There may be also situations where the proposed network passes across predominantly rural land and through another zone, for example, village or rural lifestyle, for a short section. And it is more practical and cost-effective to design and build one type of transmission method, which is overhead distribution lines. Mr. Mackey, as one of his reasons for rejection, notes that resilience of infrastructure is an additional reason for supporting undergrounding of power cables. In terms of resilience, not just the goal of Counties Power Limited, but any other electricity distribution provider.
Hello.
Sorry, there's someone talking on the telephone with their microphone on. Would you mind turning it off, please?
I've sorted, I've muted.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, in terms of resilience, one of the goals for CPL and every other electricity distributor is to provide resilient power supply without any interruptions to their customers. Counties Power, the CPL's underground network is relatively new compared to the overhead lines network, but at some stage, 30 to 40 years from now, underground network failure is likely to increase, and faults on overhead lines are usually more easily and quickly detected and repaired than those involving underground cables. There are other cost factors outlined in my evidence that I don't want to go into the details of the costs, but in general, the cost of undergrounding 110 kV lines is significantly higher than providing overhead cables. And some of the other reasons for not undergrounding could be difficult ground conditions. As I previously mentioned, speed of repair and fault finding is much higher and quicker in terms of overhead distribution lines. Just looking at the matters of discretion under Rule 14.5.2 for overhead distribution lines in other zones apart from rural, they cover a wide variety of matters of discretion that include the functional need and operational need and the benefits derived from the infrastructure, the extent to which the proposal is in accordance with the relevant industry standards and meets the specified clearance requirement for operational and safety reasons, to name a few. All these matters are considered by the CPL's network design engineer as part of their due diligence and feasibility before finalizing a route and design for any location, even where consent is not required. Furthermore, earthworks associated with the distribution poles are very minimal, as the disturbed area is significantly reduced. For the above reasons, I consider that it is reasonable to expect new overhead lines as a minimum in village rural lifestyle, industrial and heavy industrial zones, and within road zones adjacent to these zones. The proposed amendments in blue in Appendix 1 of my primary evidence enables overhead lines up to 110 kV, up to a maximum height of 25 meters in the zones that I previously mentioned. Therefore, I request the rules associated with overhead lines to be amended to reflect the reasons or the standards that I've raised above. I'd like to now move on to subdivision in proximity to distribution lines network. It appears that the CPL submission was misunderstood by Mr. Mackey and Transpower, as our submission was unclear, and for this reason we apologize. The main intention of the submission point made by CPL was to support the rule, and CPL was seeking a similar activity status for subdivision provided for in Rule 1442 RD4, which applies where subdivision of land is located within National Grid subdivision corridor. CPL do not wish to propose a specific setback, as this can vary due to a number of factors which are addressed in the New Zealand Electrical Code of Practice for electrical safe distances. CPL seek that the presence of overhead lines or cables is acknowledged at the subdivision consenting stage, and advice sought from CPL on a case-by-case basis. This approach will ensure that matters can be addressed, which include but are not necessarily limited to how close the buildings can be erected to a line and safeguarding suitable access to the line for future maintenance and operation purposes. This will ensure any subdivision within proximity of the CPL lines can operate safely and efficiently and enable compliance with the New Zealand Electrical Code of Practice standards. Therefore, CPL requests that matters of control or discretion that addresses this within the subdivision rules of the individual chapters are incorporated. I have recommended a few matters of discretion in Appendix 1 of my primary evidence. In doing so, the proposed changes will give effect to policies 617 and 6117 of the proposed Waikato District Plan that seek to avoid reverse sensitivity effects on infrastructure from subdivision, use, development, and have particular regard to and protection of the effectiveness and efficiency of the plan and existing regionally infrastructure. In coming to ancillary buildings, Counties Power Limited sought to amend rules to increase the gross floor area of ancillary buildings up to 250 square meters. As a typical switch room has a floor area of up to 250 square meters. Mr. Mackey in his evidence has requested CPL to provide examples of the switch rooms. The latest being CPL have recently served notice on Auckland Council to establish a new designated site to establish a substation in Bombay in Auckland. The design plans indicate a switch room with a gross floor area of 224 square meters. Other examples include Tuakau, 187 square meters, Pokeno with a gross floor area of 420, and Waiuku with 280 square meters. A switch room typically comprises distribution switchgear that takes supply from one or several transformers and splits it up into multiple feeders, control cabinets, communication cabinets, and protection cabinets, which serve to control the switchgear inside the building or other assets outside the building. And for these reasons, a larger gross floor area is required. An example is of an example floor plan and site plan is included in Appendix 2 of my primary evidence as requested by Mr. Mackey. Further, typically substations are built on designated land that require an outline plan of works approval under the Act. The discretionary activity status proposed is onerous, and we request that Council either revisit the gross floor area limits or insert a less onerous activity status, such as controlled activity. I consider controlled activity status would be appropriate in terms of the effects. Landscape visual mitigation is typically prepared and provided with any application for new switch rooms, substations, and transformers, including outline plan of works application to mitigate the effects. I consider that the matters of control can address visual effects in any mitigation offered or proposed by the network utility provider. In terms of my conclusion, I consider that the amendments to some of the rules seek to enable overhead distribution lines as a minimum in the village, rural lifestyle, industrial, and heavy industrial zone, and road zone adjoining these zones. Overall, I consider that the amended version of the proposed Waikato district plan recommended by Mr. Mackey, subject to the amendments sought, as discussed this morning and contained in my primary evidence, provide a clear framework for the ongoing operation, maintenance, upgrading, and development of the electricity distribution network, whilst appropriately managing potential adverse effects. In my view, it will support CPL in achieving its core purpose to consistently deliver a safe, secure, and cost-effective supply of electricity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayala. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Yahoo?
I just had one question, and that was around the overhead lines. So you talked about the cost, and you talked about easier to fix, if they were damaged. Isn't it going to be more likely that the overhead lines are going to be damaged, given the changing climate with the winds and the storms that we're having more and more often now? Isn't that another reason?
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure about the statistics about the damage that has occurred to the CPL network in the past. With Mr. Chair's permission, I can see if Rachel or Adrian from Counties Power are able to answer that question for you.
Good morning.
That's fine. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, good morning. Adrian was going to talk to this, but unfortunately he has problems logging into the Zoom meeting. So yes, ours is a mainly rural network, and we have to have a balance between the cost to provide and the complexity, the ability to actually reinstate power. We have had storms in the past. I think there was one a year or so ago, and we did fantastically compared to other electricity distribution businesses in actually reinstating the power in record time. I think it is a balance. We understand that in the ideal world, the aesthetics would come into play and everything would be underground, but that's costly. As Siobhan has stated, the faults on underground network are more difficult to find and put the power back on for the customers in a shorter space of time. It's far easier to patrol and find a fault on an overhead line than for underground cable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions, but thank you for your submission, and it's very clear. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Ms. Gibb?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions from me, Mr. Mayala, and thank you for setting out in your appendix the specific drafting. That's always helpful. I suppose, I understand the point that you're making about the need to be able to ensure that the network that Counties Power operates is able to operate effectively and efficiently and cost effectively and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering though, that if you had, not if you, if one had a property in, for example, the village zone or one of the zones where there are people living, and suddenly you had a 25-metre tower literally on your front doorstep or across your back fence, whether that being a permitted activity as you propose might be a step too far in enabling efficiency at the expense of amenity. Do you have a comment on that?
just in terms of my personal opinion,
well, your opinion as a planner really is what I'm interested in.
yeah, I mean, it would stand out if it's something new that's being built in front of their house or their property within the road reserve. Yes, it would stand out. It would be obvious there's a new structure.
But it might also raise serious concerns for a particular property potentially by having a, it might not just be a line, it might be a pole, right in front of your living room window, and with the main view of your houses. And your rule says that would be your proposed rule P2 would make that a permitted activity. And I guess I'm asking you is whether, on reflection, something that was relatively enabling, but at least had a consent pathway in those circumstances might be more appropriate.
Yeah, I think in an urban environment such as a residential zone, it would have adverse effects. In terms of semi-rural and rural,
they're the ones I'm commenting on. I don't mean rural specifically because you haven't requested that, but you have requested it for the village zone, and you called it the rural lifestyle zone. I think it's the country living zone, but that doesn't matter. I mean, the principle is they are areas that people live in, and I would have thought might be expected to at least have some say if Counties Power was proposing to put a great big power pylon right smack bang in front of their house.
Okay, and just
sorry, I was going to say, could I add to this to try and answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
The village zone and the rural lifestyle, or the country living zone, as we call it, is probably more akin to rural.
Well, I don't think the people that live there would say that. The people would say that that's their home. They're living in a village. They're not living in the country. They are living in a zone that's specifically set aside for people to live in. So I think I don't know what you're going to say next, but I think you need to be a bit careful with that assertion.
Okay. What we'd say then is where we're putting up a new line, we would tend to get in touch with the residents anyway and work with them, and obviously we would put ourselves in their shoes that we don't want to stick poles in front of the living room window, and the maximum height of poles is usually about 14 metres.
Okay, and just a question of clarification too. Counties Power only runs 100 kV and below, doesn't it? All the 220 and above is Transpower.
Correct, yes.
Is there any opportunity for you folk to do 220 kV should you need it as an offshoot from the national grid? Or is that all regulated that you aren't allowed to go above 110 kV?
I couldn't comment on whether it's regulated, but there's no plans, and there hasn't been any plans yet.
All right. Very good. Okay, thank you very much, both of you.
Just following on from what the chair raised, what's the status with the residential? You talk about village.
It's restricted discretionary.
It's what?
In terms of, it's restricted discretionary.
Okay.
Up to 110 kV. If it's over 110 kV and if it's in an identified area, it's fully discretionary as per the latest version of the chapter.
Yeah, okay. And you see a distinction between that residential and the village zone situation?
Yeah, just in terms of the policies, in terms of how they're worded, they say that they're characterized by rural and semi-rural in terms of the characters. So that's one of the primary reasons for recommending that rule of permitted activity status for those two zones.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you both very much for your evidence and answering our questions. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the Commissioner.
Thank you.
Which brings us to Take a Whata Land Limited, which I think is Dr. Forrett.
Yes, Commissioner, I've got with me Mr. McKelly and Pavinda Kaur. We are just using this opportunity again to bring to the panel's attention our concern that there is this anomaly in the proposed plan that would reintroduce the Tikawara West structure plan references and associated rules. We're in a situation where council seems to be relying on a historic decision by the Environment Court in circumstances where both the regional policy statement and now the national policy statements have changed since that decision, and there doesn't seem to be any justification in the proposed plan for retaining either references to the structure plan or to the more restrictive rules. And we note that the section 42A writer has suggested getting around this essentially by removing reference to the structure plan and just listing out the areas where the rules apply. But in my submission, that is really not addressing the issue. And the issue is why or whether there is any justification for that different set of rules to apply. And our submission, there is no justification. And I think in summary, Mr. McKellie would be quite happy if the normal residential rules applied. He hasn't got any problem with those. And we've set out some legal submissions on that issue, and we'll probably want to revisit that in the rezoning hearing. And the only other point that we really wanted to pick up on was just having a look at that proposed wording for policy 6.5.2, and we take, having looked at the section 42A writer's comments and look back on it, and perhaps it didn't express quite as clearly as what we were trying to achieve as we could have. But essentially we're looking at giving a policy that gives effect to what's actually said in the objective. And that's recognising that the provision of infrastructure can cause some adverse effects, and that those effects need to be managed and can be managed and mitigated. And that shouldn't be a reason for ignoring the efficiencies and the necessity for that infrastructure. So we've kind of tried to reword that a little bit to make it kind of more clear and relate directly back to the objective. But in my submission, there isn't really another policy that deals with that issue in the policies that flow out from that objective. And that's it in summary. You've got our fairly comprehensive submissions on the point, and Mr. McKellie's happy to answer any questions in terms of specifics.
All right, thank you very much for that. Let's see if there are any questions. Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions, thank you.
Ms. Gibb, any questions?
No, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
I just had one question, and that was, could you just give an example of how one of the rules in the structure plan is more restrictive than you see would be appropriate if the amendments weren't made?
Yes, there was a table provided with the submissions, and if you have a look at that table, Ms. Corr's got it on her screen, but my eyes won't quite go there. That small.
Well, by all means, put it on the screen is fine. Mr. Bell can facilitate that.
With our submission, didn't we?
Yes, it is.
It is attached. And if you have a look at the that particular table, what it does is set out the differences in the allotment sizes between what happens in Te Kaupara West under the proposed zoning in comparison with what happens under the residential zone. And in essence, you've got a situation where under the operative plan with the structure plan in place, you have provision for approximately 8 households per hectare. Under the proposed plan with the Tikawhara West residential zone in place, you have provision for 8 households per hectare. And under the proposed Waikato district plan, you have provision for 16 households per hectare in a residential zone. And in our submission, that is far more consistent with what's actually provided for in the in both the regional policy statement, which I think was 10 to 12.
12 to 15.
Sorry, 12 to 15.
Yeah.
And in the national, the new national policy statement, which is the national development, urban development. I think it changed its name, policy statement. So it's essentially it's the rules and how they relate to the development potential that you can do on a site.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Tiaho. Mr. Cooney, any questions?
Yeah, taken at a high level, it just seems to me that the argument is from your from the Section 42A author's point of view is that you've got a specific structure plan you had that defined how development should happen. The area that's Tikawhara West has been developed in accordance with that structure plan, or is being developed in accordance with that structure plan. People have bought in there. It has a certain amenity values as a result of more space, etc. And now you're coming along and saying, no, we don't want that anymore. We want to have more intense development. That's the one argument. Now, on the other argument is the simple approach. Well, we're entitled to do that because this is a review, and it's like any areas anywhere else that you can change the density. And we've had debates, for example, in Auckland about high rises, etc. That's the sort of argument we've got here, isn't it?
Commissioner, no, I don't think that's quite fair. There's only a very small portion of Tikawhara West that actually has been developed. There's quite a large area that's consented but not developed.
Okay.
But this is a situation where the consenting and the Environment Court process preceded a whole lot of policy changes. And in my submission, the operative plan, the proposed district plan doesn't seek to retain historic decisions on other things just because they were decisions of the Environment Court or just because they were previously structure plans.
Don't get me wrong on that. That's what I said. The second argument, the other argument is that things change. That's what I'm saying.
And that's what we're saying is that there has been a monumental change in the way in that residential development in this area as a high growth area is to be addressed. And the proposed plan looks to us like it's just rolled this provision over. And what we're saying is that there is no justification for rolling over. There's nothing special about this site that justifies rolling over those provisions, and yet there are a whole lot of other policy reasons for changing them.
And if I could just add to the comments that Dr. Forrest made, I would, without knowing exactly, I'd say probably 1/4 of the Tikawata West zoning has been given effect to via way of a subdivision. And as has been said in submissions and in comments, the world has changed significantly since that zoning was put in place. We've now got far more emphasis on affordability and on efficient use of land, and also we've got policy statements in place about restricting the extent of development spread into rural land. So more efficiently using the land that is already there, in my mind, meets with those requirements, but then I guess you would say the unlegislated push toward more affordable housing effectively requires us to try and get more efficiency out of both the land, but also the physical resource that will be constructed by way of infrastructure. Because, I mean, if we build a kilometre of road and we've got 10 houses off it versus building a kilometre of road and having 15 houses off it, you've still built the same road, but you can potentially bring that section to the market cheaper. Probably the one, and it's not a planning element, but the one developer who has developed in accordance with those rules went bankrupt and has had to sell on the balance of their subdivision undeveloped. So the market overall does not find it an efficient use. And therefore you've got 3/4 of this zone sitting there undeveloped. So that is an even more inefficient use, that you've got land that is not being developed, that has been set aside for development. So, I mean, as a developer and somebody working in other jurisdictions, they are moving more toward trying to increase the efficiency of land use. We're working in Christchurch, we're working in Tauranga, and they have rules that just say 15 sections per hectare. And they have the minimum lot size is very small, but they're working on a law of averages, basically, that you'll come out at about the 450 or what have you. But you might lose land to a stormwater pond, you might lose land to a collector road. So they're looking at the overall big picture of efficiently developing the land and getting, a balance there between what gets provided, the price efficiency of that, and also the amenity aspects that we're seeing more in design controls and those sorts of things that are associated with them. So,
yeah, I mean, I was going to raise that point with you, that efficiency on its own, you've got to look at amenity values and things like that, don't you?
And I mean, speaking from my experience, if we don't provide those amenities, the sections will struggle to sell. People still want to see their investment protected by way of what you do. Now, that becomes difficult because we do it by way of covenants. For instance, the subdivision we're doing in Christchurch, the one we're doing in Tauranga, is supported by about 9 and 11 pages of covenants respectively. And people buy into those quickly and simply because they just see my investment's protected. Now, I wouldn't want to see a district plan loaded full of those items because, they are case by case basis things. But there's a whole, I guess, recipe that we have to follow to be successful. Part of it's efficiency, part of it's the product that we produce, part of it's protecting people's investment. And the world has changed significantly. Affordability is high. Well, affordability is now, from my perspective, as somebody looking to sell these sections at the end of the day, people can't just find another $20,000 or $30,000 or $50,000. The bank won't lend it. And it is the house and land package that the bank is lending against. It's actually very, very difficult for first or probably even second home buyers to go to the bank and just borrow money for a section and then say, oh, well, I'll get my own builder to do this. Bank says, no, we want a fixed price package on the whole thing, so we know what we're lending against, so that at the end of the day, we have security that we've got an asset that we can on-sell if this all goes very sour for you. And so we have to produce a product that can be built on efficiently as well, developed efficiently, built on efficiently, and the investment is secure for the purchaser and the lender. So it's all here filtering through this. And so what I see is reference back to a document that is or isn't in the plan. And I mean, that is a significant question. That creates uncertainty. And as soon as we have uncertainty, that impacts on valuation, that impacts on our ability to raise finance, it impacts on our ability to develop the land. So there's a bunch of balls up in the air, but pretty simply, reference back to an old document is not helping.
Just, Mr. Macaulay, just from your own experience, this push for efficiency, and I take your point about all the covenants and that, but I would anticipate they relate to the section itself and what can be done and what can't be done. How do you address the wider amenity, in that sense, the desirability of living in an area, etc.? How that's a little bit wider than what you've just described. Yeah, can you just tell us how you deal with that?
Generally via the design and the implementation of the covenants. So, for instance, we look at how an area will be laid out, where your larger sections or your mix of sections will be. I mean, some very specific examples, we require the garages to be set back at least the distance that enables a car to park in front of them. So if you've got visitors, they can park off the road. We don't have cars, blocking up the road. The front door to face the street, to have percentages of glazing following the street. What you would probably see, I guess, in more detailed or complex district plans, avoiding sections backing onto the street, trying to avoid retaining walls facing the street. And then looking at how do we integrate into an area. If I look at the example we're doing in Tauranga at the moment, we've put in more walkways and what have you, because we've got stream edges and what the consent conditions required, because we're in a JV with the landowner. They've owned the land for 35 years. It's their legacy. They're moving on. They want something attractive there. And so that's what we are doing, but we're also looking at what is in the surrounding area. So it's a judgment call, really. You're trying to make your product more attractive or as attractive as the other competitors in the market. Coming back to the efficiency issue, it's really trying to maximize or make best use of those resources that we're putting in the ground, the pipes, the stormwater pond, or what have you, to try and, again, be competitive in the market and bring that section price down so it's more available.
Yeah. And Commissioner, we're not asking for anything different from in the residential zone itself. So the provisions that address amenity in the residential zone would still apply.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, just as a sort of not directly on point with your situation, but Mr. Macaulay, the NPS on urban development, the 2020 says you don't need car park requirements for development. What's your view on that?
I honestly think it's dangerous. If I look at it in a subdivision perspective, And generally the movement across the board is toward narrower streets and those sorts of things. You know, you drive through a subdivision that's under construction and you've got trades vehicles, you know, on each side of the street, and it's difficult to get through. Now, so you imagine that going forward, you've got 3 or 4 bedroom houses and you've got, you know, mum, dad and 2 kids, and suddenly there isn't space for 4 cars on a section. You're going to end up potentially in that scenario permanently. If I look at a commercial, whenever you get a commercial valuation done on a property, one of the things they'll take into account is the extent of car parking that's available. You know, it's a 500 square metre building and it's got this many car parks, and the car parks have a value because it's seen that you have to have space for employees to park, you have to have space for visitors, you know, customers to park. So you'd say that a rational developer or commercial land purchaser would go, well, I have to have car parks. It's you know, it's important to my business.
Yeah.
But there'll be some who say, well, if I can get away with it, I won't build it. And that will force it onto the road and we will see significant problems. So
yeah,
okay. I can see the, I guess you could say the market-led element behind it, that the market will decide if parking is required or not. Yeah. And we see a lot of central business districts where the council's taken the onus upon themselves to provide car parking and they don't have car parking requirements. But to take it out completely, I come back to my earlier comment, I think it's dangerous.
You finish up like some of those places at Mount Maunganui down the side roads.
Well, I mean, we see it in all sorts of places. And then, you know, your peak, you know, your peak periods, people can't find parks. And I mean, I think one anecdotal story is one council spent more money on reports trying to justify not having car parking than they could have spent on a parking building. So, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, thanks for the discussion. Thank you.
Just one question from me, please. It's probably addressed to you, Mr. McKelly. In terms of, I mean, there's been quite a lot of subdivision and development proposals in Te Whata over the last little while. What's the current state of the market there overall?
It's in an interesting position. If I look at, we do have another development there that we're just finishing out, and we keep close tabs on others. There is demand, but the demand cannot be satisfied, and I'm relying on comments from real estate agents that I talk to, because people are trying to bring sections to the market, and the segment of the market that is looking to purchase in Te Whata cannot raise finance without a house and land package. So generally what we are doing in the subdivision that we're finishing is actually spec building the houses ourselves, because that is more attractive to the bank for those first home type purchases. The house is underway, it's got a fixed price, the bank can see it and they say yes. So we're having to go down that path, which is not our core business. So where you've got instances where builders or housing companies won't move without a commitment, there's a lag now. So there's demand, but it can't, from my perspective, what I'm seeing, the comments I'm getting, it can't be satisfied because the current general delivery method isn't providing that.
And roughly speaking, how many either sections or house and land packages are on the market at the moment? Do you know? Across the town as a whole?
It could be 50 to 100 comfortably, could be more. I haven't actually done a count up, but I can think of 2 reasonably significant subdivisions that have quite a bit of capacity in them.
Like Lakeside would be one, wouldn't it?
I mean, that's putting Lakeside to one side, because there's uncertainty about exactly the
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your submissions. We're now due to hear from Chorus, Spark and Vodafone, and I think we've got 2 statements of evidence that have been submitted. One's a joint statement on behalf of the 3 telcos and also a planning statement by Mr. Horn. Just to reiterate what we've said to other submitters is that we have read the evidence. It's not necessary to read that out. We're very keen to understand what the core of the issues that are outstanding are, and more importantly, what you want us to do about them. So with that little introduction, we'll hand over to Chorus, Spark and Vodafone.
Morena, it's Graham McCarrison here. So I've got my colleague Andrew Cantor with me from Chorus. Colin Clune from Vodafone couldn't make it, and obviously Chris Horn is our shared planning witness. And so basically Andrew and me will be available to answer any questions, and Chris will take you through the few outstanding matters. We've had great conversations with Waikato over the last few years, so thank you for that, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. McCarrison.
Kia ora. Mr. Chairman, I did circulate a 3-page summary statement. Have you received that?
Yes, I've got it.
Okay, cool. Because
I'm happy to put that on the screen if that would assist you or anybody else.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
There we go. Unless we.
I can put it. I'll put it on the screen.
Maybe that would be helpful. Thank you. And if I can just do a quick correction, in paragraph 10 of that summary, which is on the last page, I refer to Appendix A of my evidence in chief, and I actually should be Appendix B. Okay,
that's fine. Thank you.
But if you have that Appendix B handy, that may be handy when we get to that point. But anyway, we'll get there when we get there.
We'll get to that when we get to it.
Yep. So I don't think I need to read anything on the first page other than to reiterate that.
Sorry, I'm showing you all my emails at the moment. I don't know why I've done that because I was.
Oh, they'll all be phishing emails.
I can show you my kingfish photo again if you like, Mr. Cooney. I'll do that later.
Thanks.
As Mr. McCarrison mentioned, there's been a lot of.
Where do you want me to be, Mr. Horn? Sorry, do you want me to flick to page 2? Is that where we want to be?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So, as Mr. McCarrison mentioned, there's very little divergence now post the rebuttal of Mr. Mackey. So, I'll just get straight to the point. So, paragraph 4. One of the outstanding matters relates to heritage service connections to heritage buildings. So I'd just like to reiterate there that I continue to support providing for service connections to heritage buildings as a controlled activity. This supports ongoing adaptive use of these buildings and contributes to their long-term upkeep while ensuring that service connections are appropriately designed and positioned via a controlled activity consent. So as set out in the corporate evidence, the telco companies have reached agreement on this approach with Heritage New Zealand on both the Opotiki District Plan and the Marlborough Resource Management Plan, and they're now seeking that approach nationally. The plan is notified, allowed service connections with no conditions. Heritage New Zealand sought restricted discretionary status through a submission which Mr. Mackey adopted in the Section 42A report. So that's still one outstanding matter. The second one relates to below ground telecommunications facilities in identified areas. So one of the problems with bundling all the identified areas together is that you can get perverse outcomes where they all get lumped in together where they may not all be relevant. So in regard to below ground infrastructure for telco networks, that would include lines, ducts and ancillary equipment such as joint pits. In my view, the principal effects of these facilities in identified areas are associated with earthworks to either install or remove the equipment. And once they're in situ, they're essentially inert in regard to the values and attributes of identified areas. The one caveat I might put on that is, as I say, the identified areas is a list of about 10 of them. The mana whenua overlays are possibly the exception to that, and I'd have to take guidance from mana whenua as to whether the actual infrastructure underground would be a matter they'd want consent for to be involved, or whether it's only the earthworks that would be at issue. But the rest of them are primarily in regard to matters such as visual attributes, or more of once the stuff's in, it's really not going to be affecting the values of the attributes of those areas, in my view. So in my view, in the rule I've referenced there, the development control on identified areas should be deleted, but if there's any specific overlays of concern, such as mana whenua, they could be separately identified rather than the whole generic term. The last one is other antennas. So the submissions sought a number of changes to the description of Rule 14.110 P7 and the related standards to provide improved clarity that the rule applies to antennas that are not dish and panel antennas. And you'll see what you've got on the screen there is we're talking about the small GPS antennas and the whip type antennas that have a very small cross section. So if you happen to have Appendix B of my evidence in chief handy, that's
I won't put it on. I won't. We will have individually. I won't put that on the screen. It's just going to get too confusing.
Yep, that's fine. So the first image, if you've got it there, is a photograph of what a GPS antenna looks like beside it.
Oh, whoops, sorry. I think I might have it on the screen. Here we go.
Oh, okay.
I have managed to do it.
So the GPS antenna, that's kind of the scale you're looking at there by the classic BIC biro. And then if you go to the next page, that's what a sort of a dipole antenna looks like. They're used a lot for sort of telemetry for networks, and the police radio network uses them quite a bit. And then over to the last page is the image at the bottom is a typical omnidirectional whip antenna, and above that what's called a Yagi antenna. So a lot of these don't look too different to, you know, the old Sky type antennas, that top image, for example, the UHF antenna. So the dishes and the panels sort of have a bit more bulk to them, but once you get down to this sort of equipment, my view is, provided you're attaching them to an existing structural building, and obviously they may need consent in their own right, but when you're retrofitting this sort of equipment to those structures, they have very limited impact subject to the dimensions specified in the rule, and in my view don't need to be controlled in identified areas. I note that in the rule from the Section 42A report, there's still a requirement for consent if you attach it to a heritage listed building. So that still stands. That's that clause 4. And that's really all I've got in my statement, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take any questions.
Very good. Thank you. That's succinct and helpful. Thank you. Let's see if there are any questions. Ms. Tiaho?
No questions from me. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
Just, there's only one from me, and it's about the connections to heritage buildings. It would seem to me inconceivable, wouldn't it, that a consent to ensure that there were telecommunications connections to such a facility would ever be declined. I mean, I could understand how there'd be extra conditions, or put it underground, not above ground, or don't attach the antenna to the, you know, to a particular heritage feature or something. But can you conceive of a scenario where consent wouldn't be granted for such a connection?
I suppose if I think about my experience with some other projects on heritage buildings in the Auckland context, I know that during Spark Mobile's rollout a few years back, sort of 2008, 2009, where they were wanting to swap out antennas on existing mounts to upgrade the technology, that even trying to make an antenna a couple of 100 millimeters larger on the existing mount, and I know we're not talking about heritage connections here, the heritage planners took the view over our dead body, and Spark ended up having to compromise the antenna choice in that scenario. So as I say, that's not heritage connections, but I know that heritage planners can be very protective of their patch, and if nothing else, it could escalate into a more costly exercise for a relatively simple outcome. So that would be my only comment on that. Mr. Cantor or Mr. McCarrison might be able to provide.
Well, no, I'm just asking it from your point of view, as from a planning perspective, given the you're proposing that to be a controlled activity. And if it's inconceivable that consent wouldn't be granted in some shape or form, that would lend weight to your argument. But if there are examples that you can refer us to where they haven't been able to be controlled and consent's been declined, then that would tend to take things the other way. So I suppose I'm just asking you whether, how conceivable is it that consent to establish telecommunications facilities to a heritage building would actually be declined consent outright? I can see how an alternative option might be required, or some sort of mitigation or sensitive design or whatever else, but it does seem pretty hard to contemplate a scenario where consent would actually be declined, and that's what I'm really asking you to.
Well, look, I can't give you a specific example on that. I've only got the antenna one, but I could conceive of, say, an aerial solution being declined to drive an underground solution, for example, which just may not be necessary or appropriate in the circumstances.
Could you address that by way of a controlled activity rule, though? Or
well,
not? Or would that be fundamentally different application, do you think?
Look, I think if declining it, if imposing conditions, is my understanding of the case law, would result in it fundamentally not being what you wanted to do, then they possibly don't have that much scope. To me, it's more whether you connect the connection box, for want of a better technical term, on the front facade than just around the corner on the service lane, those sort of solutions, or colour matching it, or...
But does that not sort of undermine your controlled activity proposal? Because what you're saying is that there are potential applications that probably should be able to be declined, or am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
No, I think, Mr. Chairman, you're misinterpreting it. I think it's more providing the most appropriate solution in the circumstances and working with council if necessary to tweak things, rather than fundamentally not being able to do what needs to be done to connect that building to make it useful for the user.
Yeah, but what if what you're proposing as a controlled activity, which has to be granted consent, is one of the examples that you've just talked about, that is potentially inappropriate in the circumstances? You've already said there's limited scope to require something different to be done. So how do we justify the controlled activity rule, given your answers?
Sorry, I think the answer I was trying to give is it's more about the design solution, the design outcome, than the do it or don't do it.
All right, okay, I understand, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just on it, have you finished? Sorry.
Yes, I have, thank you.
Oh, just another question about the below ground telecommunications. You say, well, no, these are covered by earthworks and there's no need to make them have a status per se. Is that basically your argument, Mr. Horn?
That's correct.
Yeah. How do you put these in underground? You drill them in underground, don't you?
Depends on the circumstances. So sometimes they're drilled. So for example, if you've got a sensitive ECA or something, you can drill underneath it. You can drill under rivers. Sometimes they are trenched in difficult, rock conditions and the like. So there's sort of a mix of, and then once you've got ducks in the ground, you can pull other stuff through them in the future once they're in situ.
Yeah. What's the status of earthworks for that type of work?
So in the earthworks rules, in a number of the identified areas, it's a consent trigger. And I think the only one that doesn't have any consent triggers is the urban expansion area, which was clarified in Mr. Mackey's rebuttal.
So it'd be discretionary or restricted discretionary.
Yeah, of that ilk.
Yeah, and you're happy with that?
Yes, I think that's reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Horn, Mr. McCarrison, and Mr. Cantor. That's very helpful. Thanks for your time this morning.
That's off.
Which brings us to Transpower, please.
Good morning. I hope you can hear us all right. So
yes,
I'm Pauline Whitney, planner at Bothanisco, and I'm joined here by Dougal Campbell, who's the Environmental Policy and Planning Group Manager at Transpower, and Andrew Renton, Senior Principal Engineer at Transpower.
Thank you. Good morning.
So, I appreciate the panel's probably read all our various bits of evidence, so I think we'll just give a really high-level highlights.
That's fine. We're particularly keen for you to focus on areas that are outstanding and issues that are outstanding, and equally importantly, what you want us to do about those matters.
Noted. Okay, so I think hopefully it's clear in our evidence, but we'll take it through. So if it's agreeable, we'll start with Mr. Campbell, just giving a really quick overview of the National Grid and some of the key issues. And then Mr. Renton will focus on probably the National Grid subdivision corridor and the issues about the variable versus fixed width that's been raised by Kāinga Ora. And then I'll just give an overview of the outstanding planning provisions. But just as a comment, genuinely really supportive of the Section 42A report, and there's only probably just some minor issues outstanding. So I'll hand over to Mr. Campbell now.
Kia ora tātou katoa, kei Transpower e mahi ana, hei kai whakahaere tau toko mahi ko Dougal toko ingoa. No reira, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Dougal Campbell. I'm the Environmental Policy and Planning Group Manager at Transpower. Just a brief summary of where I guess we are with the National Grid. We are the National Grid. We are infrastructure of national significance. We cover 12,000 kilometres of lines around New Zealand. We have 167 substation sites, and we have a continuous, I guess, growth area connecting new customers, which are generators, generating new renewable and non-renewable generation plant, as well as our distribution companies, your local lines companies who need new GXPs for us to provide more load to their regions. Within the Waikato, we have a significant portion of our infrastructure traversing through the Waikato. That's outlined in my evidence and on the appendix map. And what we do generally is systematically go through all the plan changes around the council, as you're aware, and we submit on the grounds that district plans and regional plans recognise and provide for national grid infrastructure to manage the effects of other people's activities on our operations, and we manage the effects of our operations on other people's activities. There are a number of constraints which we need to manage, which is outlined, I guess, in Pauline's evidence from a protection corridor and what that looks like and why we have it, our approach to a 12-metre wide yard and a 35 to 37 metre wide corridor for subdivision controls. We're trying to manage the effects of other people's activities, ensure we can operate and maintain the grid into the future. So our main approach to that is to implement our national policy statement for electricity transmission activities. I guess as a point, we only seek the minimum district plan requirements to manage the effects of our assets. And what I mean by that is that we've got a 12-metre wide yard, and that is the bare minimum of where the conductors will sit in an everyday condition with no wind. We aren't managing all the effects of our grid. A transmission line has magnetic field, electric field, audible noise, conductor swing. Those effects are greater than the yard we seek. For a greenfield project, a new line like the NICA line which traverses through the Waikato, we designate for those lines, and that contains all our effects, and our corridors of minimum 65 metres. So quite a different approach. So we're just going with the bare minimum approach of what we can achieve to minimise our impact on other people's activities. So we look at the land use activities, we look at subdivision controls, and we look at earthworks. They're our main primary focus areas. And whilst working through this process, we have to work with councils, with iwi, with stakeholders, with federated farmers, with Port New Zealand, with the rural sector, and urban community groups to try and reach outcomes which are best for all parties. And on that note, I would like to generally support the Waikato proposed district plan. I think it's provided the basis of what we're after. And the planning framework is recognised in our National Policy Statement. So thank you to the panelists for that. I think it's best to hand it over to Andrew you can probably illustrate the engineering specifications of the grid.
Okay. Thank you all. Amenity. The grid, it's a long piece of linear infrastructure. We've got a couple of pictures to show you because this is the issues associated with the line.
So can you just see that? I've shared my screen. Is it coming through?
No.
No. Oh, okay.
So while Pauline does that, and when you do get it, just do let us know. Through the Waikato district, there are a number of lines, as Dougal has mentioned. The latest one was the 400 kV capable line that was built just recently.
We've got it now. We can see the pictures now.
Thank you.
But some of the 110 assets, the lines that were built between Hamilton and Mary, and they go all the way from Bombay down to Atiamuri, they were built in 1925 and 1927, and they were built at the time under the government of the day. And like a lot of the other 220 lines that were built, long pieces of linear infrastructure that were built in the 50s and the 60s, they were built under existing use rights. So as Dougal indicated, there is no underlying corridor that Transpower actually owns to contain our effects. So we want to minimise all of our effects, but the assets that were built in the 1920s through until today. The key thing that we're trying to manage is everybody normally looks at a transmission line and you're seeing it normally in still air conditions. And that would be having the insulators hanging vertically down and the wires kind of in line with the arms on the towers. And this picture that you see here is of the DC link, but it makes a good example. You can see that the conductors are well to the side of the tower that is supporting them, and this is called blowout. And this is the reason that we have the corridor and we have the yard. So the yard is the much smaller 12 metres, and then there is the corridor. Although we're trying to control what's going on in the yard, we're between the yard at 12 metres and out into the corridor. What we're trying to do is to make sure that any development that gets that is undertaken there takes into account the transmission line such that we can release as much capability to that landowner as possible without impacting on their safety. And if these wires blow out to the side, it would obviously be a silly idea if somebody had a 4-storey building somewhere outside of the 12-metre yard, but within the corridor.
Just on that,
That's
sorry to interrupt you, but just while you got that photo up, the 12-metre corridor boundary, is that based on, that's measured from the structure itself? It's got nothing to do with the distance out of the overhead lines, is it?
It's established by looking at how that is established is by looking at all of the lines, and it's 12 metres either side of centre line, and it's where the lines might move, where the wires might move in everyday wind, which is up to about 30 kilometres an hour if you have something in the back of your brain. So they will move gently out to that distance.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
But it's from the centre point. It's 12 metres from the centre point, not from the tip of the line. So it's 12 metres either side of centre line.
Centre line of the conductor?
No, centre line of the structure.
Okay.
Centre line of the pole or centre line of the tower. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So they will. Cool. Understood. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to manage in there, is nothing in that 12 metre either side of centre line. And then once you're past that point, actually having a conversation to make sure somebody doesn't put a really tall building in, but you might be able to easily slip in a single or maybe a 2-storey building, depending just how far away from the centre line of that of the transmission line you are. And that's fundamentally the big one. I don't think there's anything else other than say then there's a lot of lines that run through that part of the country. We don't currently have anything on the plan to do anything, but there are a number of solar farm developers and wind farm developers who are wanting to build things in your part of the world, and eventually they all need to be connected to the grid. So we'll need to take that basically as they come along. And that's really fundamentally all I wanted to say. And happy to take any questions once Pauline's done her bit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll just briefly go through my outstanding points. I'm sharing my screen again, if that's of benefit for the panel.
Yeah,
it's
that's
just
fine.
my
Thank you.
summary highlights. So just you'll notice in paragraph 5 there, I've just really basically in response to the officer's rebuttal.
Just before you do, Ms. Whitney, you've still got the picture of the grid.
Have I? Sorry.
Yeah. You might need a different screen or do something
I'll
different.
stop sharing slides. I'll try again. Okay, so bear with me. A little bit of time. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on. I'll just talk through it anyway, if that's all right. I'll close that one. What? I'll just talk if that's okay. That's not playing.
Got it. Thank you. You'll just need to expand it a bit because it's pretty hard to read.
I think Fletcher's kindly brought it up for me.
Get it. Thank you.
So my screen's just small. Anyway, I'll talk through it. So basically, in response to the rebuttal evidence here, a couple of the outstanding points have been addressed, so the number's been reduced. So there's effectively.
Sorry, but it's the green arrow for expanding.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm just trying to refresh it. So effectively, there's just 2 minor points, which are really just technical references. Thank you. Apologies. So we'll go down here. Oh, sorry, Fletcher, if you just go down to the table below. So there's, out of the 9 points, 2 have been addressed, 2 are just minor reference, really, technicalities, and so there's 5 outstanding. So I'll just briefly go through those really quickly. So the first one's just in response to policy 6.2.5. So the green text there is the ones I still continue to seek and support. Basically, it's just a cross-reference that one to other provisions and policies in the plans, just to make it clear if there's, for officers and for interpretation issues later on, if there's a conflict between the national grid objectives and policies and other policies in the plan. I just think that clause there in green in the first row would benefit. And I've used the word takes precedence, so it doesn't discount consideration of the other policies such as SNAs or ONFLs. It just highlights that that policy 6.2.5 is the main one. The second point there is regarding substations. So I still consider a discretionary activity status within identified areas as appropriate for national grid substations. I think the reasons are outlined in all my evidence, primary and rebuttal. The third point is one of those just minor technical reference ones. That fourth point there has been addressed, that's in purple, so that's fine. The officer's taken on board the comments. The last point there on that page is the officer recommended references there, including a range of permitted activities. I still don't believe they're necessary because they are covered under the permitted activities. I just think it confuses things and makes the rule longer than it needs to be. Moving down the next point there, just let me know if I'm going too fast.
I know, we've read this, so that's okay.
Well, NC5, again, the officer's taken on board those amendments, so that's very good. The next one there, NC9, it's just in green, it's just a minor change in wording to reflect the evidence of Horticulture New Zealand in terms of using the word protective canopies. Transpower's comfortable with that, so that's fine. And then NC11 is really just a additional non-compliant rule. I'm seeking clarification that really tidies up the linkages between the permitted rules and then non-compliant. And then the last point there is the advice note. Again, I think is appropriate to include. It's something that's occurred in all other plans with Transpower submitted on and I've been involved with. Really just highlighting the need that Transpower will be identified as an effective party for activities which do trigger the national grid rules. Transpower has had instances in the past where it hasn't been consulted, notified, and it just creates a headache and leads to adverse and perverse outcomes when it could have been avoided. So it just makes it crystal clear. I think we all understand the national grid and the importance and how the rules work, but I really appreciate later on that officers sometimes, not intentionally, but it can be overlooked in terms of making sure and Transpower is consulted with and notified. So those are the outstanding points. So again, I think they are quite confined, and as I've said, we're largely in agreement with how the plan's been proposed and the officer's recommendations.
All right, thank you, Ms. Whitney. Let's see if there's any questions. Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you. It's very clear explanation. Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Just one question, and it only just got mentioned briefly, but is there any trigger point or any other measure that would lift the capacity of the 400 kV capable line to be increased to the 400 kVs as opposed to the current 240?
So the line was designed and built at 400 kV capacity, and it was consented and designated as such. It's currently operating at 220 kV. So all we need to do to increase the capacity is to put the step-up transformers and switchgear at both ends, which I say flippantly and is about $100 million worth of work, but that's all we actually have to do. The line is designed and built for it. It's similar to other lines that we have done in the past. For example, the 220 kV line that runs from Henderson to Silverdale was built in the 80s at 220, but it was operated at 33 kV for a number of years until the load demanded that it went in, because of course it's always easier to build it when it's just a paddock than it is once it's all built out. So we're continuing a historical good practice, which is build it for what you need in the future, but operate it at a lower voltage until that time because it's cheaper.
Yeah, so from a district plan perspective, it makes no difference to the plan.
No difference.
You've got the you've got your necessary consents. It's just a matter of you requiring it when the demand's there.
Correct, absolutely correct. But there's no change to the line. It's all designed and built as a 400 kV line. You would know no difference.
And obviously that line's designated as well. So that provides the yard and the corridor protections as such. So it's not relying on the grid rules that we're discussing really today. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions, but kei te mihi atu au ki a koe Dougal I tō kōrero Māori.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Mr. Yaho. Mr. Cooney.
Yes, just as a general background, have you these same provisions? Have they been incorporated into other district plans?
They have. Probably Auckland is the one where there's a bit of variation, given just the amount of underbuild and existing urban and industrial business development, which has got the lines. But everywhere else, I've been assisting Transpower in a planning capacity for the last 9 years or so, and this is essentially the approach that has been sought since over those 9 years. So with a bit of refinement, I guess, and acknowledging that things are continually evolving and examples continually come up to date, especially given the amount of pressure and development pressure going on at the moment. So they're getting refined, but the approach is pretty much the same. Yes.
An example of the refinement would be, there was a picture in Dougal's evidence of a pole standing up on a big piece of dirt, like a big donut, and it's being refined because we're always continuously amazed at how inventive people are at interpreting, codes of practice and pieces of legislation. And although it 100% complies with the minimum safety requirements of NZECP 34, this pole is completely isolated from our ability to actually access it and maintain it, because they dug out all the dirt around it down about 3 meters, and it's now just isolated on its own little island up somewhere. So we keep having to refine the rules based on the inventiveness of people's interpretation, and that's just life, and that's okay. But it is interesting how you think you've got it sorted, it's not.
Yeah. So how many district plans would have this? The similar type provisions included? Do you know?
Well, we're up to probably 60% of the district plans in the country.
Okay.
60 to closer to 70% now.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a standard 12-metre yard with a 35 to 37 metre corridor. So it's a standardised approach. And I guess that's post 2008. I mean, we worked closely with Federated Farmers and Horticulture New Zealand to try and agree to that approach, and that's generally been rolled out now quite consistently across the country.
Okay, thank you.
So if I could just maybe make one comment in regards to the policy context, that is probably evolving a bit more given the recent MPSs coming out, case laws such as King Salmon, which have, probably I think there is a focus now by Transpower on providing a bit more clear and directive policy framework in terms of the national grid. So.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Just one question from me, and this is sort of going back into history. I know from previous hearings and previous involvement in other cases that historically there's been a bit of tension between Transpower and landowners in terms of access agreements and so on and so forth. Is that situation still reasonably live, e.g. where there is no negotiated access agreements? Or has that largely been resolved these days?
That's largely been resolved. I mean, that's a good point. For new build projects, like the NIGUP project, the 400 kV project, that was, we had to procure a property right for access and the designated corridor width. And so that was a long and drawn out process. For the existing assets where we have a right of access under the Electricity Act, we've negotiated, we have good relationships with probably 99% of the landowners. There's always a handful, but that's well established. We've got a landowner relationship team within Transpower to facilitate entry and access. We're focused under our previous CEO, Patrick Strange, and our current CEO, Alison Andrew, on the landowners are our key stakeholder. They host our assets. So there's a lot of emphasis on working with them and around their farming operations and calving and lambing and minimising disruption and bundling works. So yeah, it's quite a mature approach now, I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you very much for that. All right, thank you for your evidence and time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Which I think brings us to morning tea time. Could I just ask people that are intending to come back after morning tea to just not log off, but mute and turn their video off? That way there'll be no issue reconnecting. When we come back, we'll resume at 5 to 11, please. 5 to 11, thanks everyone. It's 5 to 11, we'll resume, and we're due to hear from Ms. Wharf from Hort New Zealand, please.
Good morning all. Thank you for the opportunity to present. You have my evidence in chief and a rebuttal statement in my summary.
Yes, we do, thank you.
Right.
I should just repeat, just before you start, I should repeat for the record that you have made mention in your evidence about the submissions by and evidence on behalf of Genesis. Because of the declaration I've previously made, I won't have any involvement in considering those aspects of what you've raised. I won't disappear when you talk about it. It's probably not very sensible given that it's quite a confined point in the overall scheme of what you're talking about, but I just do need to put that on the record again.
Thank you.
So thank you.
So I'll just go through my summary and just highlight the main points. I did provide a text amendments, but I'm not sure if in the translation the changes are still in there as appendix 1 to my summary, whether the changes are still shown in there as strike through or whether they've automatically accepted, delete and add. However, I'll talk to those as I go through. So I'll start with policy 6.1.2, where the section 42A report is recommending the addition of the need to access infrastructure. Hort New Zealand, I noticed an interesting discussion with Transpower around relationships with landowners, and that's really a key matter in terms of how infrastructure operates on private land. Now, what concerns me about the addition in policy 6192, the need to access infrastructure is being put in the district plan as a matter to be considered, whereas Hort New Zealand's position and my position is that that is a matter that should be dealt with between the relationship between the landowner and the infrastructure provider. And I'm not convinced the need to actually add it as a matter into the district plan.
The district plan, though, can't override a landowner's rights to grant access to their land unless it's under some statute that allows that to happen.
True, but so my issue then is, does it need to be in the policy?
Isn't it dealing with physical access, the location of things, which is a planning issue?
Are we talking about the infrastructure corridor, which is a different, or the access over land to get to the infrastructure corridor?
Okay.
Yeah, I must admit I didn't read it as being a trumping of landowner rights. It was simply saying that it was important if you've got infrastructure that you need to make provisions in a planning sense as to how to get from, for example, the road network to it. When considering resource consent applications, for example, because there was no point having stranded assets that couldn't be accessed. But I didn't see it as providing any rights of access as such, because that's quite separate.
Yes, well, in previous experience we've had with First Gas, who sought this change, that was part of accessing their network, was what was driving them wanting that change. and
All
that
right.
was over private land. So it's
Okay. No, we understand the
historic-
point. We understand the point that you're making. So that's fine.
In terms of policy 614, just a minor point, I regarded the clause 4, managing adverse effects on the environment, as not necessarily being an infrastructure benefit, and wasn't sure why it was included in that policy. Then in terms of objective 616 and 617, which are the ones that I have the difference of opinion with Mr. Matthews on, regarding reverse sensitivity, I recognise what Mr. Matthews is saying is that I haven't dealt with all policies relating to reverse sensitivity, all policies from the RPS in terms of reverse sensitivity. I focused on the ones that related to regional significant infrastructure. The dilemma Mr. Matthews has is that there are also policies about regionally significant industry, and given that he has argued that Huntly Power Station is both regionally significant infrastructure and regionally significant industry, he's wanting to apply those regionally significant industry policies in the infrastructure provisions. And given that the policies 616 and 617 are generic to all infrastructure, I don't consider it's necessarily appropriate to bring in regionally significant industry considerations into that policy framework. So that's where Mr. Matthews and I digress on that. I'm not saying he's got it wrong. I think just that if there is particularly differences specific to Huntly Power Station, then there might be a neater and tidier way to address that issue rather than through a generic provision related to infrastructure generally. I'm particularly concerned about the use of the word protected in 616 and the implications of protect. And it's certainly what was driving the 42A report on this particular objective was the MPS for electricity transmission. Now, I'm of the view that there are specific provisions under the National Grid in 626, for instance, that are specific to the National Grid. Therefore, the MPS should not be driving 616 and 617, but it should be generic to all infrastructure. And therefore, the question is it appropriate that infrastructure, all infrastructure, is protected from reverse sensitivity effects? And so New Zealand's submission sought that there was a policy about managing the potential for reverse sensitivity effects rather than a pure protection policy. And I put that in my straight through an alternative, and that was sought in submission, so there's scope to change that approach. Just a minor change to 618 about wanting to add land use into that policy. It's fairly minor. If we go to the National Grid provision 6.2, I support the Section 42A report who does not support the gas network being included within the National Grid provisions. It's quite specific that the MPS is related to the National Grid line. Objective 621 have sought the deletion of the word protected. The MPS for electricity transmission seeks that the National Grid is recognised and provided for, and that is the wording that has been used in plans throughout the country where Hawke New Zealand and Transpower have been involved, and in several cases they've accepted the deletion of the protection element in the objective, and we would expect the same to occur here. In terms of the environmental effects, I'll skip over that and just go to the reverse sensitivity policy. I support a slightly revised 626, I certainly support the addition of the words "to the extent reasonably possible" into policy 6.2.6 because that is consistent with the MPS. But the wording I've proposed just is a slight nuance on what is here in 626. In terms of the National Grid rules, the main changes we're seeking is consistency with NZECP 34, except in certain places where we've agreed with Transpower for variation. I note your previous discussion that what's being proposed here is consistent with what's elsewhere in the country. Attached to my evidence in chief, I put the provisions from Western Bay of Plenty. And if you compare particularly the earthworks provisions in the Western Bay of Plenty plan and what's proposed here in the Waikato plan, there's significant variation. And I recognise the issue that, you know, the photo that Mr. Campbell's included, but what we want is that growers can continue to maintain doing normal day-to-day operations, and the new limitations on earthworks being sought would limit the ability to operate within the National Grid yard within constraints under NZECP. So the earthworks provisions are a point of considerable difference, and they're not, what's being proposed in this plan has not been agreed between Horticulture New Zealand and Transpower. The other issue that I've got a problem with is the definition of minor upgrading. And you heard this morning from Mr. Renton, who talks about how they've built lines at a higher capacity but haven't been operating at them. And that's fine. But the problem we have is where a line has been constructed at a lower voltage and then upgraded. And what happens is that a landowner, if the upgraded line goes across their property, if they don't then meet the new higher or greater separation distances required by NZECP, there is a cost to the landowner. Therefore, if the line is being upgraded to a higher voltage beyond what it was originally designed for, I consider that it's important that the landowner is involved in that discussion around the minor upgrading because it has an implication for their property. Those are the main points that I just wish to highlight out of my evidence in chief, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wolf. Mr. Cooney, any questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Fulton.
No, probably not a question, but quite interested in your submission because I've got a farm property that's got 9 pylons on the property, so I'm well aware of all the transmission line issues that we referred to in the previous submission as well. So well aware of all these issues. But thank you very much. No questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton. Ms. Tiaho.
Sorry, no, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb, any questions from you?
Yes, just one minor question. And I have seen evidence of the communication between Transpower and owners. They tend to send letters, which is quite good. But your last comment about upgrading a line to a larger capacity, have you had any examples of that happening where there hasn't been the engagement with the landowner in advance?
Some of our growers have had that experience where lines have been upgraded to a higher voltage and then they haven't met the clearance distance. So yes, there have been growers who have been affected by that. Not necessarily in Waikato, but it could well happen.
Yeah, no, well, my point was, have they had the engagement? Like you said, it's happened, but has Transpower engaged with them?
It's more common with the distribution companies like Counties Power than with Transpower, and I can't confirm what engagement the various distribution companies have done with those growers. Sorry, I could find out if you want me to. But,
oh no, I just hadn't heard of any examples where Transpara hadn't engaged, but I just wondered if you had those examples.
Yeah, it's more at the lower line level than at the Transpower level, because the Transpower certainly have got their landowner liaison officers who would be engaging with landowners. That's
okay.
A process set out quite clearly.
All right, thank you, Ms. Wolf. Thank you.
And I have no questions. Thanks, Ms. Wolf. Thanks for your evidence.
Thank you.
Our next submitter is Mr. Arbuthnot from representing Ports of Auckland. Thanks.
Good morning.
Morning.
Can you hear and see me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm just seeing if I can't see you at the moment, but I think that I can't see you.
Okay, let's try.
But we can hear you.
Hold on 1 second. Let's see.
Here we go.
Okay, how are we going now? Perfect. Excellent. Cool. So you've obviously got my primary evidence, rebuttal evidence, and summary statement on
yes, we have.
Thank Auckland. Having listened to the hearing yesterday, in particular NZTA's presentation as well, I wonder whether it's just the best use of time if I just address very briefly the one point of disagreement between myself and NZTA.
I think that's helpful. Look, we've well appraised. You've appeared in a number of hearings. I don't think there's any point going over ground that you've covered previously. Absolutely. So focus on the outstanding point, please.
Thank you. So the submission point itself was seeking to retain the permitted trip generation for the Hor2 Industrial Park, and that's that 15.4 trips per hectare peak hour. And that has been accepted within the evidence by Mr. Mackey as well. And I agree with the provisions that have been set out by Mr. Mackey in evidence. However, I still disagree with the thresholds that are proposed by NZTA. And I'm saying this acknowledging that there is a carve out proposed for the business park. But my opinion is that it's somewhat missing the point of what my evidence is actually saying. And it still contains that 1 truck equals 3 cars clause, which again will reduce permitted trip generation for industrial activities by 1/3, which in my opinion is quite significant. And as the Chair identified yesterday, the traffic generation rule is essentially a rollover in the operative district plan. And so if we are making changes to those provisions, they do need to be underpinned by a Section 32 analysis. And there were some questions about, these rolled over provisions existing for a reason. Obviously, HORA2, as we've identified, was agreed through a consent order on appeal to the operative district plan. I also understand that the Huntly Power Station and Huntly Quarries traffic generation rule were similarly arrived at through the appeal process. And I also note that the Kofi Air Park zone is subject to its own 32 analysis, which includes a traffic assessment, which also includes a summary of consultation undertaken with NZTA that does not raise traffic generation thresholds as an issue generally. So there could be others that are affected in a similar manner, but I don't know because NZTA haven't really particularly undertaken a Section 32 analysis to get to the bottom of those issues. And my opinion is that there hasn't been any real sound rationale presented for the reduction in the thresholds, other than from what I've understood from the evidence and presentation yesterday, that the provisions that NZTA are putting forward are the same as which has been imposed by way of a consent order in TCDC. But the notified provisions are not sufficient to address the effects of heavy traffic movements, and the notified provisions are not sufficient to prevent, as Mr. Wood put it, adverse traffic effects. And taking each one of these issues in turn, my take on the provisions that are contained within the Section 42A report are that they are reflective of local issues, and it's appropriate for the district plan to be responsive to local issues as well. And invariably, these will change from district to district. So, TCDC hasn't had a 4-lane expressway built through the middle of its district, and they may well have different infrastructure constraints or transport infrastructure constraints, whether it be capacity or resilience within the Coromandel Peninsula, that may well warrant a more onerous approach to managing the effects of traffic generation. But there doesn't appear to be any evidence produced by NZTA to demonstrate that there's an underlying issue within the Waikato district that would warrant such low traffic generation thresholds. And then, of course, when we look at heavy vehicle movements, the provisions that have been recommended by Mr. Mackey do address the effects of heavy vehicle movements. Each one of those permitted standards in the traffic generation rule do contain heavy vehicle movement thresholds. And again, there's been no real analysis from NZTA as to why these volumes are problematic, or precisely what effects within that are specific to the Waikato district that they're concerned with that would otherwise justify such a low threshold. And then finally, that final paragraph of Mr. Wood's summary statement at 313 sets out NZTA's position that the current provisions do not go far enough to prevent adverse traffic effects. And again, in my opinion, that's not the correct starting point. My view is that the transport network needs to support growth and productivity within the district and the region. So I support the rule that's been proposed by Mr. Mackey, and I don't particularly think the NZTA rule is efficient or effective, and really I think it's unnecessarily onerous in the circumstances. So that's really, I think, the top and the bottom of it from my perspective, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Mr. Arbuthnot. Ms. Te Aho, any questions?
Sorry, no, I don't have any questions. That was very clear. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No questions, thanks, Mr. Arbuthnot.
Mr. Cooney?
Thank you.
And I have no questions either. I think we've just now got to figure out whose evidence we prefer, as opposed to asking any questions of clarification, because I think that's quite clear, the two different views. So thanks, Mr. Arbuthnot. That's very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Our next and I think final submitter for the day, unless I'm mistaken, and I don't think I am, is Kāinga Ora, please. I'm not sure if it's Mr. Allen or Ms.
I am,
Devine.
and I'm pretending to be Alex Devine, I see on the name. Can you hear me?
I'll pass no comment on that.
Can you stop that screen? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We are collectively in one room, but we think it's probably better to address you from a computer that's right directly in front of us.
No, that's helpful, thanks.
So we'll be doing a bit of a shifting around the table as we go through. With me today, Alex Devine, who's from Alice Gould, assisting me, Brendan Liggett, who's from Kāinga Ora, and who is able to answer questions that you might have of the organisation. Matt Lindenberg is a planner, who'll deal with the national grid issues. John Stiles, noise vibration expert, dealing with the roading and rail, and Phil Stickney, planning, dealing with road and rail. So you have my legal submissions. I've got, I think, 10 minutes to go through what I have in front of me as speedily as I can and then answer any questions. These are submissions that and evidence that's going to focus primarily on those three topics I've just referred to. There are some other elements that Mr. Stickney will cover in his evidence, but these are the fundamental issues that we want to talk to you about. One of the issues, as an introductory comment, that arose yesterday in your discussions with other parties, in particular with NZTA, Waka Kotahi, was about whether there is a prospect of a all-of-government approach to these issues, given that these are government entities in various ways. The answer to that, I'd agree with my friend, is yes. There are discussions happening, there's consultation occurring, and there's a process that's being talked about as to how to proceed from here. The issue really is that because these plan provisions have come up at this stage and that process hasn't been resolved, then for the debate to be occurring, we need to do it through this entity and through this opportunity. So at some point, hopefully there will be something that's sort of a national approach to this that recognises nuances in different places, but does have a national approach to it. But that needs to be worked through. So for today, unfortunately, we're all here expressing slightly different views. We are aligned in the sense that everybody agrees that where you have significant issues related to noise or vibration, then the plan ought to deal with, and parties ought to deal with it. The issues that arise really is how you do that. And in particular, the questions are to what extent are landowners and occupiers to be constrained in terms of activities that they carry out on their land as a consequence of major infrastructure that goes by or over it, are required to ensure that any development by them incorporates physical or locational requirements to deal with effects that are generated not by those landowners or occupiers, but by other activities that are infrastructural in nature. So there's a couple of points that I'd just like to emphasize in that context. The first was you had a discussion yesterday from Ms. Sheard about the statutory responsibility in terms of roads, and in particular to take account of social and environmental matters. And we accept that that's in the legislation. The issue, of course, here is who should be responsible for addressing the social and environmental matters beyond the road, if you like, or beyond the rail. And there's a question, I think, from Commissioner Te Aho yesterday about whether and to what extent the evidence was being put forward, because there was a recognition that perhaps there are vulnerable people in many cases who are living in places that are alongside these major routes. I'm not sure there was an answer to that, but the submission I'd make here is that we're really talking about who should be wearing the cost of those things, of the mitigation. And our reading of the provisions that are proposed is that it is not the infrastructural entities that are proposing to deal with that other than on their own track or on their own road. When it comes to constraints, they are affecting the residents and the occupiers, and they are in many cases vulnerable people. Some of the properties obviously are Kaingaora properties, but most are not. By far the greater majority of affected properties are not Kaingaora properties, but the issues remain. And in a sense, Kaingaora is here because of its wider statutory obligations under the new structure and the wider range of issues that it needs to address. So what's essentially being proposed here is that there be constraints on land use, there be constraints on and requirements in terms of how you do things, but those costs all fall on the landowner. And what we're looking to do is to try and find a better balance between those. You'll recall that the evidence deals in some places with circumstances such as the Auckland International Airport, where there are provisions in place in the Auckland Unitary Plan that address what people can do in areas that are subject to varying degrees of noise arising from the airport, and then obligations in terms of who funds some of the work in relation to those areas. So historically, Auckland International Airport got in the plan protections for it in terms of what people could do and the density of development and the form of development, but it also had obligations in terms of funding things such as additional protection for existing houses that were affected as noise levels went up. Now, in this case, that model has been rejected, if you like, by the requiring authorities or the infrastructure providers. And in part, that's because they're saying that in the case of an airport, you're measuring where you're going to get to in terms of noise. But in my submission, we're in a pretty similar position here. We're assuming that roads of a certain characteristic, state highways particularly, and the rail will have certain effects, and we're dealing with that by a blanket control in terms of meters. And that's pretty blunt, because there is no evidence before you, and we say this in submissions, say this in our evidence, as to whether we even have a problem in this district with road noise causing either health and safety issues or reverse sensitivity issues that flow from people complaining. And when we read the material coming in from both, in terms of both the road and the rail, our initial reading, Mr. Charles' in particular, was that there was a focus really on reverse sensitivity. But I think yesterday's hearing was interesting in part because the discussion about complaints in terms of roading really didn't go very far, because not all people are complaining, it was acknowledged. And the discussion turned very quickly to health and safety issues. But if you're going to raise provisions that put impacts on occupants and residents of land in relation to that, you first need to establish that in fact you have an issue. And in this district, we would say there is no evidence that there is an issue in terms of noise or in terms of vibration. If one arises, then you might need to deal with it.
Mr. Allen, just on that point, we all know rail and heavy trucks make significant noise if you're living there alongside them. So we can take that into account, and really we're saying, well, how do you address that? So what's your answer here? You just can't say, well, you haven't proved it.
Well, I think there's a I think there's a big gap between saying trains and trucks create noise and saying that produces an adverse effect that warrants a series of constraints on what people can do next door.
Okay.
So in some circumstances, it will be significant enough to create that issue. In others, it won't. So this is a debate this is not the first time the debate's been had. Auckland Unitary Plan was the most notable one in terms of the depth of debate and potentially, of course, in New Zealand, the range of effects that can arise. And the position we got to there is very different from what's being proposed here. Now, there are circumstances around the country where there are occasional rules in place. I know some of them. I know Smales Farm. It's a private plan change. NZTA, Auckland Transport submitted. They said, we like some controls. There was a debate. There's some controls in place on noise. There are some that don't happen on vibration. But that reflected in large part a negotiated outcome by parties trying to avoid taking it on to the environment court, if you like, and reach an agreement. So I think those kinds of specific examples are interesting, but they're not actually definitive because they're not the outcome of a testing of the debate. What we have here is a district that has a lot of rural areas, but of course, some significant townships, and the townships, as we're talking to you elsewhere, for different reasons, are likely to grow significantly in the future. They're between Hamilton and Auckland. They're in the tier 1 districts now in terms of the NPS UD. So we're in an area where there will be growth, and we're an area where the relationship between these kinds of activities and urban areas particularly is of concern and interest to Kaingaora. So I think, sir, there is a big distinction between saying there's a noise and saying that feeds to an effect, and that this is the way you should resolve the effect, because there's a whole lot of ways of dealing with those effects in the middle that we say need to be thought about more. And they might be bunding, they might be sound walls, if you like, alongside roads, state highways, and clearly they happen some places. Clearly, and we've said this in our material, the most efficient way of dealing with those things is for the roading authority to build them rather than individual people building it. And I think there was a discussion yesterday about walls in some parts of the district where some people had done a good job and other people hadn't. And then, of course, you've got the issue not only of who constructs it and how well they construct it, it's who maintains it and how well are they maintained. So there's a level where the most appropriate response is at an infrastructural response rather than a site-by-site response. And we're identifying those issues and saying, I don't think we've got an effect yet that warrants these provisions, but in any event, if the provisions need to be there, maybe the approach that you take is slightly different from simply saying to landowners, you can't build without spending more money on the quality of the construction you're putting in place, the quality of insulation, your transactional costs in terms of going to the council, going to a planner, going to possibly a noise expert, going to the authorities, roading authorities and otherwise, and talking to them. There's a whole lot of costs in here, and I know there's been some material, but it's all a bit loose, and the vibration issues in particular were very loose in terms of cost.
Okay, thanks for that.
I'm conscious that my time is running away.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
We'll give you a credit for the answer to that question.
Thank you. I'm just trying to identify which points in particular I should touch upon going through those submissions that you've got, sir. I've talked about the AAL, the evidential basis as I've set out in the submission. There's a Section 32 test and obligation. There is also now, we would say, the NPS UD 2020, bringing in additional obligations with specific reference to So how we deal, what evidential base we need for controls. And in summary, evidence, I say, will be required as to the resource management issue to be managed. It is most fundamental. That involves establishing, as we just said, whether there's an issue that requires management in this case, in this district, and if so, how you might do it. And then you need to consider where the costs of those constraints or the costs of those mitigation measures should fall, and how you get the right equitable balance between the infrastructure provider, who after all isn't driving the truck, or but is providing the infrastructure that allows that to occur, and the landowner who happens to live next to it. And look, there may be a circumstance where the approach you take differs depending on your zoning. And it differs depending on whether you've got an existing township or a new, part of a new township, or a new part of an existing township, if you like. So parts of Pocono, which develop dramatically, are quite close to the motorway. But when there's a rezoning exercise there, you might look at these issues in a different way than you do in terms of an existing centre or an existing part of that centre. And critically, whether I'm building a new house or whether I'm extending an existing house, because that latter creates all sorts of issues. And we're potentially in a position where some of these areas that are very close to major infrastructure end up not being developed because it becomes very expensive to add a bedroom to your house or to convert a non-habitable space, if you like, into a habitable space. And we end up depressing the form of development there until we get to the point where somebody just says, well, I can now remove the house and replace it. So there's a whole range of issues, and they do come through the evidence about I suspect, unintended consequences of rules such as this, and whether they end up constraining the ability of centres to be developed, simply because we've got constraints in the plan that we may not need. And we say, evidentially, we probably haven't reached that point.
Mr. Allen, I was going to ask you at the end, but you raised the topic now. So if you don't mind, I'll just ask you the question while you're on that topic. I think you're saying that you anticipate there might be a different approach taken for existing titles and existing land uses and alterations thereof versus what might be future growth related subdivisions, for example, that create new towns or new areas.
I think there is a rationale for that, and I think this is a factor that would come in when you're doing the structure planning. You'd identify, for example, the rail goes here. How will we deal with that? And if it's rural land, you might not zone the land immediately adjacent to the rail into urban at all.
That's what I was.
You might choose to put it somewhere else in the town.
So you're saying that in those circumstances, the sorts of buffers that NZTA and Kiwi Rail are proposing could well be appropriate. But not in relation to, but not in relation to an existing town where Kaingaora may have some existing property, wants to knock them down and build something new. You'd say you'd address that by way of, for example, noise insulation and whatever else was necessary.
There will be a range of ways that people respond to the issue, and I suppose the conversations that are happening ultimately might lead to some sort of consensus as to how you manage these things in a nuanced way in different circumstances.
Right.
It's and we're not trying to get that nuanced answer through this process. What we are simply doing is saying we think what's proposed is a little bold and produces these adverse effects, and it's not necessarily justified. But
all right, no, I understand. Thank you.
So turning then to the national grid. Sorry?
I don't think anyone said anything.
Sorry, Commissioner.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Gibb had a question for you. Sorry.
Since we're talking, I thought I might as well jump in too, since you've all been jumping in. I just want to ask you about the double glazing, the standard that these days people are building anyway because of healthy homes. So nothing to do with the rail or road corridor. Aren't people building houses now because they have to build houses to a standard for healthy homes for good insulation and warmth? So wouldn't that, it's going to happen anyway, isn't it? Can you just give me a bit more feedback around that?
I think Mr. Stiles, who will speak later, and we'll get him to answer that when he does speak, rather than playing musical chairs at this point.
Okay.
I can address that. Yes, there are standards that apply in terms of how you build houses and expectations, and they change, and they have changed. We would, and one of the issues again is how do you deal with the circumstance where you've got an existing house and you're adding to it, as opposed to building a new house that replaces the old one. It's a lot easier in a sense to get it right with a new house than it is to refit, if you like, or retrofit into an old house. But Mr. Stiles will
okay,
drop that down, won't you, Mr. Stiles?
Thank
Well, now.
Just can I just add in there, Mr. Allen, because we sort of got a policy of sort of we can interrupt lawyers as they're talking.
That's fine.
We don't do other people. So you're fair game. Just on that point raised by Commissioner Gibb and then the chair, if you're going to replace an existing house in an established town, you got no requirement for insulation, have you? So you can just build it whatever the building standards say. So how do you bring in that situation, some apart from a distance type, which we already have or has been notified, how then do you bring in the acoustic requirement in that situation? It's pretty difficult, isn't it?
Well, and I suppose the answer to that, in a sense, is the discussion that we're trying to have to find a more nuanced set of provisions that take account of the different circumstances that are applying. At the moment, it's very much within this area. You're required to do certain things, and the range of circumstances that kicks into is very broad. So there may be a position ultimately where, in some circumstances, because of proximity or because of an analysis being undertaken as to whether there's a noise issue, because topography, buildings in the way, a whole lot of factors may mean that something that's quite close to a road doesn't actually have a noise issue, say, and Mr. Stiles deals with the vibration control that says that shouldn't be there at all. But in those circumstances, there may be ultimately a series of provisions that identify where you would do certain things, but where you wouldn't.
But
and at the moment,
your situation here is you're saying, well, we really haven't reached that position because
right.
We haven't gotten a rigorous cost analysis.
A, we don't know whether there's a problem. B, we don't know if there's going to be a problem that warrants an RMA response. And that's an evidential issue as much as anything. C, we don't know how best to respond to it. And that is a full 32 analysis, which may have different responses in different circumstances. But we're not at that. And that may have a component that is semi-national as well as local distinctions, because the issue it can be described in generic terms. The response may be a little different depending on where you are and how you're dealing with it. But I do think it's too early to do that, and it's certainly not the right response, the one we've got so far.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So briefly, the National Grid subdivision corridor. I've got some, again, legal submissions on that. There was some commentary today about there being 60% or something of the plans in the country having these controls. I have to say, whether you get the controls in or not, so in part, I suspect, depends on whether people are aware of the issue and respond to it. Certainly in Auckland, the issue became very clearly a matter of discussion. And yes, that's largely an urban area in terms of population, clearly, the metropolitan area. But the issues that arose, I think, were worthwhile looking at and thinking about. And the outcome that we got in Auckland was a consequence of the unitary plan process, where some things could be appealed and reviewed and some things couldn't, because of the way that the planning structure was set up. High Court proceedings in terms of the appeal to the High Court on matters of law, back to the Environment Court and a series of provisions that were subject to extensive mediation. And what we learned through that process was that a blanket number isn't necessarily going to work. And particularly with respect to the cigar shape, to the swing of the cables, there are areas that were to be subject to controls that didn't need to be. Now, part of the response from Transpower in this case is to say, well, if we did the maths, if we did the analysis, we might find that there are areas that ought to be subject to the controls that currently aren't, that the 30-metre area doesn't hit. In part, our response is we ought to know. It is a worthwhile inquiry to make sure we get the figures right. Now, it matters less, I suspect, in rural areas again, than it does in urban areas. But in urban areas, there are places where people are being required to go through a consenting process that they ought not to be. And our suggestion is it's worth doing the work. It's worth Transpower or the infrastructural authority doing that work and spending the money on it, because otherwise you're imposing on other people the obligation to do the work or to make the inquiry, and they may not be able to afford it, or they're being put to significant cost. So I've gone through the rationale given in the Transpower case in a little depth. What I would ask you to do is to go back to that report from Neville Higley, I think it was, on these issues. I think it really encapsulates quite crisply the matters involved here. I've probably covered through those discussions the essence of the balance of the submissions. I'll just check if there's anything else I needed to say specifically. There was one issue about consultation being arguably a matter of discretion or a matter identified in advice notes. Leaving aside what an advice note says, and I'm not that keen on advice notes in district plans, but or I have to say in resource consents, but in terms of it being a matter of discretion, I just don't think consultation is something that's amenable to that. It's a matter of process, and it relates to the provision of information. It's not something that's directly related to the effects that are generated by an activity, or in respect of which you can impose a condition that says anything other than just go and consult with somebody. So my view is that consultation is a process issue rather than being something that is rightly dealt with in terms of matters of discretion or matters of criteria. That's probably summarised what I had. Any questions? I'm happy to answer. Any further questions?
Alan, let's see if there are any questions. Ms. Gibb? Ms. Tiaho? I've lost Ms. Tiaho on my screen. I can't hear.
No, I don't have any questions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, thank you for that. Mr. Fulton?
Probably just raise a point about the Kiwi Rail yesterday saying that they're treating all lines as being the same as the main trunk line for all their setbacks. So that affects Huntly, especially Huntly West, and the Kainguru has quite a long property in that area. So it just seemed interesting to me how they were going to treat that as the same as the main trunk line for this setback and noise standards.
And I suppose my response to that is and maybe even less rationale for the controls in the cases of the lines that have less traffic. But we're not convinced that we've got to the point where there is an established rationale for controlling these things anyway, in the case of Waikato.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Kearney, any questions from you?
Yeah, you don't get off the hook just yet, but just with the national grid issue, you say your position is really, look, we don't think you've done your homework like you did in Auckland. You know, we're not opposed to this, but you haven't done your homework. Go away and do your homework and then come back and we'll, you know, how do we address that issue because of the time delays, and we'll have a decision out by the time all this stuff comes back and then properties get developed. So how do you handle that approach?
Well, I'm not sure of the timing. I think from memory that when they did the work in Auckland, it was a couple of months that was required. And presumably the people who did that work learnt what they were doing and how to do it. So that involves an analysis of the width, the length of the span, and what that means in terms of the swing of the wire, because the longer the span, obviously, the wider the wire swings. I don't know if there is a timing issue in that regard. Obviously, we're partway through this process, and this process is part of a longer, potentially longer process. So I'm sure through that longer process, there's plenty of time. But it does seem to me that it's the sort of information that, particularly in the urban areas or the areas around the urban areas, is really valuable and did make a difference to landowners knowing whether they were affected or not, in fact, being affected or not. So it's a worthwhile inquiry. But I don't think the amount of time required is necessarily prohibitive.
Yeah. Okay.
And I suppose you could also deal with matters of principle, and then the implementation of that might be happening in parallel with your thinking about the matters of principle.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, that's all I've got.
I just want to take that one step further, Mr. Allen. Our panel to date hasn't been averse to, suggesting that parties go away and convene and see what common ground is able to be reached. We've done it a number of times. And it seems to me that as we're currently positioned, whatever we decide will probably find no favour either with you or the infrastructure providers. Somewhere along the line, we'll cause, an appeal situation to arise. And I suppose the question for you is that, and given that we're not making any decisions on this plan until, close to this time next year, we've got a fair way still to travel. Do you think there is merit in there being a Waikato specific set of provisions agreed on a, if I could call it, whole of government basis before we actually have to make decisions?
Yes, whether that's possible.
Is that something that
I think
your client would entertain and see merit in? Because otherwise, all it's going to do is
certainly very comfortable,
and our decision will come out. You'll appeal it, or the infrastructure providers will, and then nothing gets settled for, as long as that process takes. Whereas if by the time we're due to make our decisions, there was some considerable narrowing of the issues, perhaps, or dare I say, even agreement reached.
Look, Kāinga Ora is always open to discussions, and very much so on these issues. It certainly worked in Auckland in terms of the Transpower issue, and I think it would be very worthwhile having that discussion in the Waikato context on that regard. And as I've explained earlier, in terms of the travel or the transport infrastructure, there is a discussion ongoing there. But again, a direction to try and get people together is welcome. It helps reinforce the internal pressures to have those discussions. And if it would assist you, we are certainly we're certainly very keen to do so.
Well, we'd rather issue a decision that the parties had a consensus on, if that were feasible, than us having to say we prefer X than Y, because as I say, all that's going to do is kick the debate further down the road.
Agreed.
And it all over again. So we haven't been shy in suggesting that in the past.
No.
And I'm not sure if Council for any of the infrastructure providers are still with us, and I think the Transpower people are still here. Ms. Whitney's still online. if you don't mind, Mr. Allen, I might just canvass the views of those other infrastructure providers, particularly NZTA and Transpower, to see whether they see any merit in such a process.
No, sir, I don't mind that. And I would just emphasize, I think with the time frame you've just explained, it is entirely logical for everybody to get in the room and try and nail it through this part of the process rather than the next, because that's got enough time in it for people to progress things, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Whitney, is there anything that, what do you say about that?
As I understand, discussions have occurred. There have been a few meetings. I understand I wasn't party to the latest one between Kāinga and Transpower. I guess the refinement of Kāinga concerns only really came up in the last meeting and through evidence. As I understand,
I'm not too worried about where we've been. I'm worried about where we might,
okay.
go.
As I understand, Transpower's position is they think the corridor, the fixed width corridor, is the most effective and efficient position and solution, and it doesn't support a variable corridor width. I mean, I can always ask Transpower if they want to go and explore that further, but as I understand, their position to date is that what is in the plan is appropriate.
Yeah, but that's not the point of my question. I know that, and I know what Mr. Allen's submission says. You've got a different opinion. And all we're saying is, surely it makes sense for you and them to see whether there may be some middle ground or some prospect that can be addressed. No one's suggesting that you give your legal rights away by exploring the possibility of an agreed outcome. Because if we reject your submission and adopt Mr. Allen's hypothetically, then you know, that's a lose-lose scenario, isn't it? You've got to go and argue it again, whereas and then probably be sent off to mediation by the court and probably agree something. And all we're trying to do is to say, doesn't it make sense for you to explore whether there is any possibility of an agreed outcome? Because otherwise all we're going to do is to pick a winner and a loser, and one of you will be delighted and the other one of you will be highly annoyed.
Yeah, agree and totally accept that. And I'm only speaking as the planner, not as Transpower.
No,
so I
well,
presume that
you've got, are your clients still there?
No, they're not. But I understand Transpower would be happy. They've always been happy to work constructively. And see
that's all we're asking.
Yeah.
We're
So
not
that's
asking.
fine.
We're not saying what the outcome should be, because clearly there are differences of opinion.
I guess
that's
sorry,
all I'm asking.
Okay, great. I just wanted to maybe highlight that there may not be a solution.
No, you can, and if
that's, that's fine. That's what appeals are for and litigation's for. But if there is one, we would, I think, feel inclined to suggest that you try your best to see if there is one.
Great.
You've got time.
Sure.
Otherwise, you sit on your hands for a year and it just gets kicked off down the road for 12 months. No one wins from that.
Yeah. No, I'm sure Transpower is really open to working.
Okay. No, that's all we wanted to know. Is there anyone from the transport agency still with us?
Yeah, I thought this was more confined to the Transpower issue, Mr. Chair. I'm just a little bit conscious with the others that that's a more of a controversial issue, and I just thought we need to have a bit of a discussion, I think.
Oh yeah, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that we order that or direct that at the moment. I'm just wanting to understand if the concept of that had any attraction for the parties.
Hi there, it's Louise here on behalf of Waka Kotahi. Christina isn't able to join this morning, but absolutely agree that without obtaining instructions from Waka Kotahi, I understand that they would be absolutely happy to discuss with Kāinga Ora, and that there are, as mentioned yesterday, there are discussions happening between the parties, and as mentioned earlier this morning by Mr. Allen, those discussions are continuing.
Yeah, and certainly mindful of the fact that those aren't the only parties that have an interest in that latter category, which I think is Mr. Cooney's point. And we're not, don't get me wrong either, we're not afraid to make decisions either, because we will. But if there are decisions that are able to be reached by consensus, then there's no harm in that at all. All right, thank you, Mr. Allen. That's helpful.
Thank you, sir. The first witness then is Mr. Lindenberg, who's going to talk about the transpower issue. And I will move stage left and he will move in from stage right.
Morena, Mr. Chair and Commissioners.
Yes, good morning. Sorry, Mr. Lindenberg, yes, when you're ready, thank you.
So I can talk generally to my pre-circulated summary statement. It's an issue we've had a bit of discussion on already this morning here with Mr. Allen. And my evidence in chief in my summary is largely confined to this one issue, which is the width of the National Grid subdivision corridor. And I'm coming at this, as Mr. Allen had noted, from, I guess, my previous experience in this kind of an issue and in the similar plan making process that we went through in the Auckland Unitary Plan. For me, fundamentally, I guess, as a planning philosophy, I support applying a management framework to address a potential adverse effect or a risk to the actual known area or the spatial extent where we know that risk or effect is likely to take place. So the issue I'm addressing here is whether we have a standard or a default 34 or 37 metre subdivision corridor width, or the process that I have proposed, which is the outcome we got through the Auckland Unitary Plan processes and the detailed mediations, which I refer to as the variable width subdivision corridor. And really what that process that we went through demonstrated through those mediations, and I've tried to attach maps to the back of my evidence in chief, as well as my summary statement, just to try and give you a sort of a visual of what that process looked like. My evidence in chief shows two maps at the back. The map at the top shows an example in one of the urban areas in Auckland through Mount Wellington, and it represents what would have been the panel's recommended 37 metre subdivision width. So that is the comparable extent, if you like, to the proposed plan provisions that we have here in Waikato. The image below shows the outcome that we achieved through the mediation process, and that is the sort of the variable width corridor below. And so you can see you get some bubbles around where the towers are, and you get an extent for the subdivision corridor, particularly within the urban environment, which quite closely matches the 12 metre yard. So how this process...
I'll just put that on the screen for you. Does that... That's what you're
exactly it. So the one above shows the wider 37 metres either side, the one below showing that variable width outcome. So you can see on both the northern and the southern extent, you effectively clip almost an additional row of land holdings between the difference between if it was 37 or if it was this more modelled extent that matched the modelled effect. And that's that process of how far apart are the pylons or the support structures from one another. That affects, as I understand, how much the power line itself could swing or move in variable environmental conditions. And that is the primary issue that then governs how wide that subdivision corridor needs to be to manage that actual effect. So the issue of having just a default 37, it will no doubt mean that there will be land holdings across the district, either urban or rural, where they will fall within the subdivision corridor, but the actual extent of the risk or effect to be managed might not require that 37. It might only be 12 or 14 or 15 metres from the centre line So we'll be applying a management regime to areas of land that don't actually need to manage the risk. So that's effectively the issue. I think there was value in that Auckland process of doing that more detailed modelling across the network to make sure that those subdivision provisions and the management framework were applied specifically to those land holdings where that risk or that effect was present. And that's effectively the crux of that issue. I also have picked up in my summary statement at 3.4, a matter that I've sort of discovered more recently since my evidence in chief. And that's really an issue of, well, how will people engaging with the plan know that these provisions affect them? So my look of the proposed plan maps, they have a legend or a key which identifies the national grid as an overlay as part of the proposed plan. But what appears to be mapped is the national grid line itself. There doesn't appear to be a spatial mapping or identification of either the 12-metre national grid yard or the wider national grid subdivision corridor. So my concern really there is, how do people engaging with the plan, applicants, readers and users of the plan, how will they know when they're triggering any of these requirements? How will they know if they are going to trigger the 12-metre earthworks provisions or a width of a subdivision corridor if they aren't able to easily identify these yards or these corridors on the planning maps? It seems it's a process where applicants or plan users might need to figure this out for themselves, which I think for me is a concern. You know, the Auckland process clearly builds those corridors into the planning maps. All landowners are easily able to identify whether they're impacted in those areas or not. And I think, again, that's something that would be really beneficial to have mapped here in the district plan. That for me is it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lindenberg. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Fulton.
No, I don't have any questions, but thank you very much. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho.
No, very clear to me. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb.
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Cooney.
Thank you.
Just one from me, Mr. Lindenberg, and it really follows up the question I asked of Mr. Allen. The example that you've shown on the, or that I was showing on the screen,
yes,
from your appendix or from your evidence, that's very much an urban example, isn't it?
It is.
And
yep.
Would you agree in at least in principle that a different approach for rural areas may well be appropriate compared to that for urbanised areas?
I think it is, and I think that the potential benefit of dropping down into an additional level of detail is far more a benefit in the urban area where you've got much smaller land holdings, so you've got far greater ability for some properties to be unnecessarily clipped and pulled in or not than perhaps in your rural environment where you've got much larger land holdings where that difference might not make such an impact on how many areas of land or sites are impacted.
All right, okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the next witness, says the voice off screen, is Mr. Stiles.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stiles. Yeah, it is good afternoon by about a minute.
So I'm going to start just by reading out a very brief conclusion and then move on to summarising my summary statement, as well as just addressing a couple of issues that have popped up over the last day or so.
Thank you.
So just to kick off with, I've heard all the relevant evidence. I was present for all of the discussions on the noise and vibration topic yesterday, and there's nothing presented in those discussions that's led me to change my position. I'm going to go through the issues one by one as I have in my summary statement, starting with road noise. And the discussion there really sets the basis for my opinion on rail noise, road vibration and rail vibration as well. So just with respect to road noise, I agree with the submitters that there is a need for controls of some sort. However, the controls currently seek to apply the overlay for noise out to 100 metres from all parts of the state highway network. In my view, that's likely to be well in excess of what's required for many areas. There are parts of the network where noise levels have the potential to be considerably less than 57 decibels at 100 metres. And that includes in settlements and towns where speed limits are low, potentially 70 kilometres an hour or less, and where truck volumes are or will be low. Examples include Whatawhata, Te Kōwhai and Raglan, just to name three off the top of my head. State Highway 1B through Gordonton is expected to be subject to much lower noise levels once the Hamilton section of the expressway is open. Yesterday, Dr. Childs talked about the 100-metre distance being relevant to roads like the expressway. The traffic volumes, speeds and noise levels associated with the expressway and other sections of busy state highway are significantly different to other low speed and lightly trafficked sections of the highway, of the network. And it's the latter where I observe the greatest density of development or potential development that would be affected by the control sought. So in those cases, the 100 metres should come down, I think, probably quite a lot. And many of the examples of similar provisions for road noise adopted in other district plans have a smaller distance for lower speed environments, and the Hamilton district plan is a good example of this. The submitter's approach does not recognise any of this. It's too broad, and in my opinion, there'll be a large number of properties covered by this rule that should not be. Dr. Childs acknowledges in his rebuttal evidence that there is noise modelling information available that could be used to inform a more refined and efficient overlay extent. However, that information is not available to this process. Dr. Childs states that the modelling is subject to a range of assumptions that have not been fully tested, and I understand that. In my view, the modelling information possessed by the submitter as it stands right now is far more robust and certain than the currently proposed standard 100-metre distance for all parts of the network. Both methods of determining the extent of the overlay are subject to uncertainty. That is the detailed noise modelling or simple 100 metres. But the outputs of the modelling process that Waka Kotahi have at their disposal will be far more certain and robust than simply adopting 100 metres. In my opinion, even if the modelling information is not available to this process, I consider that there are some simple and reliable methods of determining the overlay extent for each area of the network to reduce its extent where that is appropriate. Those methods should be adopted to refine the extent of the overlay to no greater than is necessary before it is applied. I think it's also sensible to provide for the imminent reduction in traffic volumes and noise levels on some parts of the network when the Hamilton section of the expressway opens. And further, and the last point on road noise, in my view, the wording and structure of the rules also need a considerable degree of improvement to improve their clarity, certainty and enforceability. And as I set out in my evidence in chief, I think that the road and rail provisions need to be separated because they end up, or should end up, being quite different. So moving on to rail noise, following the same approach I support for road noise, I think that the controls for rail noise need refining to ensure that the overlay and general content of the rules cover an extent that's no greater than necessary to control the effects and to provide greater clarity, certainty and enforceability. Moving on to road vibration. As with noise, I think that the same fundamental problem exists with vibration. There's no evidence to support the controls that have been proposed. My supplementary statement includes a table of vibration measurements undertaken last week. that demonstrates that even very close to the state highway, the vibration threshold of 0.3 millimeters per second is not exceeded unless there is a defect in the pavement. That includes land right next to the expressway, I think in the order of 7 meters from memory. Around 15 meters from the expressway. So in my view, this clearly demonstrates that the vibration controls sought are inappropriate, especially out to 40 meters. I've not seen any empirical or objective evidence to support those controls. Just in terms of those measurements included in my supplementary statement, I was only able to undertake road vibration measurements for this process as the timing of evidence exchange in the hearing did not permit the longer and more complex measurements required to determine road or rail noise or rail vibration levels. Rail vibration is quite difficult to go and measure because you've got to wait for 15 freight trains to go past. And I talk a little bit more about that when I get onto cost in a couple of minutes. My additional concern with the road vibration control sought is that measurements may determine that there is a vibration issue present on the building site that needs mitigating. The controls being sought would begin a process that requires the developer to spend potentially quite a considerable sum of money to mitigate that effect. And later on, I will say in a couple of minutes that that could be around $50,000. That could all be for nothing when the submitter rectifies the defect that caused the vibration issue through their next routine maintenance work. So this could be the case for my measurement sites in Gordonton at 12 metres from the State Highway and at Whatawhata School on State Highway 39, 7 metres away, where minor defects in the pavement were noted to be the cause of the elevated vibration levels. So that's the vibration levels there are set out in the table appended to my supplementary statement.
Just sorry to butt in there. Are they potholes in the road or are they more than that?
One was a pothole at Whatawhata, I think, and at Gordonton, the sealed surface was noted to be pretty uneven and rutted.
Okay.
But I think that the point there is that these aren't defects that exist in the subgrade deep down that would require a large fix. These are very much surface issues that would be picked up in routine maintenance. So moving on to rail vibration, very similar to road vibration. There's no empirical or objective evidence in this process that I've seen to support the controls being sought. I think the controls should be based on clear empirical and objective evidence that demonstrates the need, extent, and nature of the controls. So just moving on to cost, and I know I haven't dealt with this directly in my evidence, but it is, my comments today are really in response to some of the questions of witnesses yesterday. So just starting out, I've not seen a robust assessment of the costs associated with implementing the controls sought, and particularly in respect of vibration. Attached to the evidence of Mr. Wood, there is an acoustic engineering services report that looks into the cost of building mitigation in a few different scenarios. And that was talked about yesterday. So that report doesn't take into account the costs of essentially consultancy costs to go and do noise measurements or predictions to determine what degree of acoustic treatment would need to be undertaken and on what facades of the building, because it may be that facades facing away from the road need nothing. In fact, that's likely to be the case. Consultancy costs, in my view, range a fair bit. The cheapest you would likely to find would be in the order of $600 to $800. And that would be a very, very straightforward desktop assessment with a letter. But even a slightly more detailed assessment that would get down to treatment at a facade level would be between $1,000 and $2,000. So page 3 of that AES report, the same report, says that the cost could be up to 4% per dwelling when you consider only the buildings that need treatment. So that Acoustic Engineering Services report looked at the cost over larger developments that included dwellings set well back from the road that didn't need any treatment. So when only the buildings that needed treatment were looked at, that cost could be up to 4%. So you've got to add on to that then, I say generally in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 in consultancy costs as well. And that only deals with noise. For any dwelling within the vibration setback as well as the noise setback or overlay, the cost also includes a minimum of the consultancy costs for vibration, which necessarily requires measurement. There is no way around that. Plus, any actual work that needs to be completed to mitigate an effect that may or may not be present. So the costs, the consultancy costs for vibration, as I said, necessarily include measurements. And those measurements would take around a day or so for road, maybe a few hours if it's a very busy road, but possibly several days or weeks even for rail, depending on how often the rail line is used for freight. And as I said before, you need a minimum of 15 freight train pass-bys to determine the level of vibration in the ground according to the standards that are referenced in the controls. So the consultancy cost for measurements to show that there is no issue, I think would generally be around somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 for road vibration, and up to between $4,000 and $8,000 for rail vibration. And that's just a function of the complexity of those measurements, the arrangements needed to leave a logger in place for quite some time and keep that secure, and the travel costs to go out and put this gear in, bring it back in, and then analyze it all.
How much was that cost for vibration?
Between 4 and 8 for rail, and 2 and 4,000 for road. We've just to provide a bit of context there, I've just finished a project in Palmerston where we had to go and do rail vibration measurements. We couldn't really find any information on the frequency of freight train movements on that particular part of the line. We had to get a seismograph installed. We left it there for a week. Luckily, I think we had a dozen freight train movements, which was slightly shy of 15, but it was enough to get us repeatable results. And that came in, including the report through to council to show that there was no issue. That came in just on the 8K mark. But that, to be fair, that was in Palmerston, so the travel costs increased that a little. If the vibration measurements show that there was an issue that required mitigation, design work for foundations or base isolation of a dwelling could easily cost $20,000 or more. And if the dwelling is quite a distance from the road, let's say 30 metres, solving the vibration issue is likely to require quite deep piles or base isolation. And I estimate very loosely that those additional costs could easily be $50,000. And the reason for that is because you can't simply swap out a traditional residential raft foundation or slab on grade and substitute that for just a typical residential piled foundation, because that won't deal with the issue. The piles are going to need to be quite deep. There's going to be quite a lot of careful design required. And that's going to take some time and cost to design, including quite a bit of geotech expertise. Those deep piles wouldn't assist at all, or very, very little, in cases where side friction on the pile is high, depending on the soil conditions. And so you may end up with a very, very tricky design or base isolation or something quite complicated to deal with the issue. And as I said before, there's a bit of a problem because that issue may disappear once the, once routine maintenance is undertaken and the pothole or the defect or the rutting or whatever it is goes away. I think the only real potential for a problem here is we've got very unusual subsoil conditions and a vibration issue that is very difficult to fix at the source. In my experience, those are very rare. And then finally, just touching on building code. The building code requirements will do essentially nothing for vibration. There's nothing in there that will help to mitigate or reduce the incidence or risk or level of vibration inside houses. In terms of acoustics, there is nothing in the building code that really helps us either. And the reason for that is because as soon as you open a window in a dwelling, you've really negated the benefit of any glazing or any thermal improvements you might have made. And the building code doesn't require anywhere that buildings must have closed windows. So for as long as you're relying on open windows for ventilation to meet G4 of the building code, you'll have zero net acoustic benefit over any other dwelling or existing dwelling. So I say really that the building code is pretty much irrelevant when considering these controls. It doesn't help us. It doesn't get us any further down the track. So that's all the information I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stiles. Mr. Fulton, any questions?
No questions, but thank you very much. It was very helpful. Thank you. No.
Ms. Gibb, any questions from you?
No, thanks for the clarity around the window insulation and the opening of the windows. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Just one question. So just in relation to the vibration, is the only solution then a setback to minimise the effects of vibration?
No. My view is that, especially in terms of road vibration, by far the majority of any issue can be dealt with by maintenance at the source. So keeping the road in good condition. And the expressway is the clear example of that, where if you look at the appendix to my supplementary statement, we've got vibration measurements at that
on the screen for you if you want to refer
yeah,
to it.
I was really referring to rail, sorry.
Rail. Well, yeah, rail is a bit more difficult, but there's no evidence in this process at this stage to demonstrate what the level of vibration is from rail at any given distance. I know that in some areas, rail vibration can be definitely perceived at a distance from the railway line. I understand that in many cases, in many parts of the network, there's a policy to be replacing or upgrading the track with continuously welded rail, certainly through communities, it's my understanding. And that can reduce the amount of vibration perceived in the ground, quite a bit. So without understanding any of that, it's not possible really for me to answer your question directly. It may be that in some areas there's no issue at all to be mitigated. It may be that in other areas there is.
Okay, so it comes back to that kind of common theme throughout, that there's a lack of evidence to support. Right.
That's right, yes.
Thanks, Mr. Yahoo. Mr. Cooney, any questions?
Yeah, you sort of answered my question. I was going to ask you the question of, well, you say the 100 metres is too broad, but in some ways it's self-regulating, because if you meet the standards that have been prescribed, you don't have a problem. Therefore, you get out and build your alteration or new house. So, but you've now said, well, hang on, in order to determine whether you are going to comply, you've got to get the experts in to check it out. Is that basically it?
To do it properly, yes. I mean, there are some provisions in the controls that allow you to do that in a loose fashion, and that may work for alterations, for example, where you can very clearly prove that the facade doesn't have any line of sight to the road. But in other cases, particularly where someone might be wanting to build more than one dwelling, it makes a lot of sense to get an expert in to refine the design, because you could end up spending quite a lot of money on fancy glazing and insulation where it's not needed.
I'm sort of targeting, you know, that I've bought an old house, I'm going to bolt it over and I'm going to put up a new house. So I look at what's required and I think, well, you know, I don't think I'm going, how do you establish you're going to comply with this proposed rule? How would you go about doing it in practice?
So I'm just going to get a copy of the rule in front of me. Bear with me a second.
Maybe we can pull it up. Mr. Chair, can we pull up that rule?
I'm sure we can. I just need to know what version of it is, what version and where Mr. Stiles wants me to refer to it.
Perhaps the version, it's actually a very good question. I don't know which version would be best to refer to.
The most recent one, as I understand it, is the one on the rebuttal report that came out.
All right, let me see how I go with finding that. Hold on. Yeah, I think this will do. Just need to refer me to which rule we're talking about, rule number, I mean, just so that I can find it easily. I know what the rule is, but I'm just needing to be able to find it.
I think I've got in front of me the version of the rule attached to the rebuttal evidence of the council.
Yes.
At page 40 as it's numbered.
Okay, I've got that. That's what I thought it was. I've got it right here. I'll put it on now. You won't get to see my fish photo, Mr. Cooney. You'll be pleased to know.
Thank God for that.
Hang on, I'll make that a little bit. Where do you want me to specifically be, Mr. Stiles, for what you're wanting to refer to?
I think if we start at P2, that's a useful place to start. That talks about which buildings are essentially captured by the rule, being at any point within 100 metres of the edge of a state highway carriageway.
Yep.
Must then comply with section 7 of Appendix I, acoustic insulation. So I think that we need to flip to section 7 of Appendix I, which is...
Keep going down, I think.
Page 43 at the bottom.
Oh, hang on.
Actually, we can flip straight to page 44.
On such a big scale, I'm finding difficulty in finding the numbers. There, isn't it? 44?
Yep, next bed's it, right there.
Yeah.
So the rule is in two parts, really. The first part that's on the screen is the traditional method of saying, if you have a building in that area, in that setback, that is subject to this rule, it must be designed, constructed or maintained to achieve the indoor noise levels set out in that table. And there's a different column there for rail and another column there for road.
But there's a difference between designing something to meeting it and achieving it on a maintained basis, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So I think that was your question.
The trouble is that
how do you can say build it in accordance with this, and an engineer says if you put this sort of glass in the windows it'll be okay, but that's different from ensuring that it complies in practice and on an ongoing basis.
That's right, especially when the volume of, let's say, rail traffic could vary, considerably, and I think that's in the evidence of the submitters as well. So that becomes quite difficult. That's one of the changes that I'm referring to when I talk about improving the clarity and certainty of these rules. That's just one of the aspects I think needs tightening up.
Well, just before you move off that, that's my point. I'm asking. I bought an old house. I want to knock it down, and someone at council says, "Well, you better go and check this appendix there." So what do I do? I'm going to build a new house. I'm going to go and see the builder. What do I do in practice?
So, I mean, you follow this rule through. You've got the first part, which is setting out the noise levels that you need to achieve inside. Yep. Then if you move down to the or, you've got a couple of outs there.
Yeah.
And if you can satisfy either of those, then you're permitted.
Yeah.
But let's say you can't, which I think is your point. It might be directly exposed to the state highway. It could be in a town like a settlement like Gordonton, or Te Kōwhai, say, where there's some dwellings, older style, that are quite close to the state highway and well within these setbacks. And it might not be practicable to put up a very large fence between the house and the road for a whole lot of reasons. And in any case, the effectiveness of a barrier like that is going to be compromised by the fact that it'll be only in front of your own property and your neighbours wouldn't have one. And there'll be a hole in it at some point to drive your car in and out. So the utility of a singular barrier on the road frontage is very low in terms of noise reduction. So essentially, if you don't meet either of those B or C out clauses, and you don't want to design it in accordance with the construction and Schedule Y, and that may be because it's quite onerous, given that you could be 70 or 80 metres from the road. And the road could be, you could be talking about State Highway 23 in Raglan, where it's a 50 km/h zone, very little traffic at night and very low heavy vehicles. So the construction of the schedule and the requirements in Schedule Y could well be overkill. So then you might say, well, look, I want to potentially save a bit of money. I don't want to have fancy glazing on every facade of my dwelling that's exposed to road noise. I'm almost outside the setback. Traffic volumes are low. I want to see if I can meet the internal noise levels in the table in Part A. To do that, you would need the advice of an acoustic expert. They might say they will have to do some sort of noise modelling or measurement exercise to determine the level of noise on each facade. Then they would say, well, based on your standard design, with your standard glazing, facade materials, you may actually just achieve those noise levels without anything extra, apart from the need to close the windows, which means you need air conditioning and a fresh air supply. So it could be that simple. It could be more complicated.
And the cost of doing that, you've already given us that indication of cost of getting to that point.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think in a simple situation that could be as low as $600 to $800, but that's a very simple situation. It's more likely to be in the order of $1,000 to $2,000 for that simple assessment. But that doesn't take into account the actual building work you need to do. You know, for that you can look at the acoustic engineering services report attached to Mr. Wood's evidence.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. Thanks. You've taken me through that. You've got some costings there. We haven't got those, have we? Are you going to? Have we got those? What you read out by way of the costs?
No, I didn't. I only prepared that sort of overnight in response to some of the comments yesterday. I can provide those.
Yeah, could we be good if we can get those?
Sure. Yep,
Thanks,
I'll send those
Chairman.
through the hearing secretary.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I just want to follow up on this, how complex this actually is in practice, because my understanding of, I won't say my understanding, wouldn't an experienced operator like Kāinga Ora in particular know what it needs to do in terms of building its housing options to ensure that the internal noise amenity is appropriate for the residents to live in, and that they don't need to go out and do complicated measurements on each and every dwelling that they wish to construct, because they can say, we know that if we build it out of these materials, in this environment, in this way, we'll be providing noise limits in accordance with that table. I mean, is it really the case that you'd need to do this house by house by house by house by house?
I think, you know, leaving aside the Kāinga Ora policy, really just in a more general sense, it comes down to cost efficiency. And what you find is that when you do a detailed assessment, and you know, we do these, or I do these all the time for all kinds of different developers building next to noisy things, and it includes ports and industry and roads and rail and all sorts of things, airport. You find that some facades that are more exposed need heavier glazing, for example, and possibly even, you know, a masonry facade if the noise is very high. And then other facades don't need much at all. And if you're doing things on a relatively large scale, there are significant cost savings that can be had by engaging someone to do a more detailed assessment to make sure that we're achieving noise levels in the order of those set out in the table in each room.
But if I was to ask Mr. Liggett, that said, if he was wanting to build a new set of apartments in Huntly on the main road on the way out of town, on the left-hand side going north, and it needed to meet 35 dB inside, he would know that that means that equates to 50 dB or whatever it is outside. And wouldn't he say, well, we need to build these in this manner? You know, it's not appropriate to build something out of fibrillite here. I'm not suggesting that you build things out of fibrillite, by the way, but you know what I mean? This will require, in this environment, we need to make sure that this is masonry, that it's double glazed. And if we do that, we're confident that it'll meet that internal standard. So I'm making a statement, but if I could ask that as a question to you, Mr. Liggett, what's your answer to that?
Here comes Mr. Liggett.
So yeah, I guess the generic approach we would apply to it, yes, we could determine what the facade treatments are that are required, what the internal operating conditions of the dwelling are in terms of fresh air supply and other things. The issue is, regardless of all of that and any standards we may formulate, is we have a demonstration of compliance activity to go through. When we're dealing with the consent process with council, we have to actually demonstrate that we've complied. There's no point me turning up to council and saying we've designed this facade as we think is appropriate to respond to the rules. Council in its process will look for confirmation of that happening. So the compliance cost of demonstrating that will still necessitate us to call on the services of someone like Mr. Stiles to actually document and record that.
All right, okay, no, that's fine, thank you. Final question, Mr. Stiles, just to, clarification for me. The vibration standard that you're referring your appendix 1 of your summary statement to, I think is a value of 0.3 millimeters per second, if I understand that correctly.
Yes.
What does a vibration of that magnitude mean in physical terms? I mean, we've all been in buildings where you're sort of standing there and a massive truck roars past and things, you know, you hear the glasses on the shelf rattle, for example. By that sort of reference, what's 0.3 millimeters per second mean in terms of the magnitude of the vibration?
So I'm just going to pull up the standard that comes from. I'm pretty sure I've got it on my laptop here. It's definitely a perceivable level of vibration. This is, you know, we're definitely not talking about a no effects threshold here. Bear with me.
But is it noticeable? So you go, ooh, or is it you go, crikey, what the hell was that? You know, and sort of feel the need to sit down and gather your wits?
No, it's definitely not that big. It's a level that the Norwegian standard says should be achieved for building dwellings or overnight accommodation next to existing infrastructure. So that recognises that there is a level of effect that will be perceived, and a small portion of the population will still be annoyed at that level, but the majority won't be. So it's not at all a level that would be sort of startling or concerning. It's something that would be present in the background during the day. If you're moving around the house, walking around, you probably won't even notice it. It's a level that you will notice when you are sitting or lying down or doing something relatively sedentary. That's when you'll pick it up.
Because the noise standard that applies, generally speaking, is at the nighttime ones, undisturbed sleep, you know, which is sort of easily relatable to.
Yes.
Is this sort of 0.3 number sort of more or less similar to that? I know it's for a different purpose, but is this the sort of thing that if you were designing to 0.3 and a train went past in the middle of the night, would it wake you up? Is it that sort of noise, or is it something that you would just notice to the point of saying, oh, you know, there's a big train gone past? I'm just trying to understand what the standard does.
I think both the noise and the vibration thresholds fall into the category of annoying to a small percent of the population, and I'm talking maybe between 5 and 20% of the population might be still annoyed at that level. And the remainder of the population will vary, their experience will vary from noticing it to not noticing it or not being disturbed by it at all. Okay. Some people can sleep through a level of 35 decibels at night. You know, a small percent of the population can't, and the same with vibration.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions. I don't think. Is there anything else from the panel?
No.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Stiles.
Thank you.
And if you could provide those, cost notes, that would be helpful.
So, just before we go to Mr. Stickney, there's one point I think I should cover that arose from that questioning. And I'm sure we've touched on this before, but whilst Kāinga Ora is here and has an interest in terms of its own land holdings and its own development opportunities, it also now has a much broader mandate than it used to have in terms of creating the conditions, if you like, which will allow sustainable initiatives and sustainable communities and thriving communities. So the reason for the submission is not just what would happen to Kāinga Ora's investments, it is what would happen to a member of the public who has a piece of land in the same position that you described and doesn't have Mr. Leggett's vast experience at putting developments in place and knowing intuitively and through experience what a council will require and what standards require. So this is a set of provisions that applies to some small extent really to Kāinga as ownership, but it applies much more broadly to the public as a whole, and they will be doing site-specific analyses, and the plans effectively require a neighbour to do something that somebody else next door to them has already done, and the third person to do. That's, I guess, a contextual thing, but of course it's relevant also to the way that the plan provisions impact upon the public generally, and not just major players who have all that experience.
Thank you for reminding us of that. We have we've had evidence from Kāinga in earlier hearings about their wider mandate, so thank you for reminding us of that.
In that case, so the last witness is Mr. Stickney, planning evidence on those transport-related matters, and we've discussed, and hopefully he can say not too much in terms of an introductory statement because you've heard a lot from us, but it was available for questions beyond that.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and panel.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stickney.
Oh, it is good afternoon too. Time's flowing. Right.
Might be a matter of opinion.
Well, look, I'll as Mr. Allen has said, I will make this reasonably succinct. Mr. Allen picked up on a lot of the comments that were in my evidence summary and in my rebuttal, and obviously I'm relying on the conclusions from John Stiles as well. So look, there really probably isn't anything new to add. There's probably just a couple of points I'd like to pick up on. And firstly, I absolutely acknowledge from a planning perspective, this is a complicated issue in terms of creating a cogent framework for managing a level of effect. The issue is that I haven't heard anything at the hearing yesterday that changes my opinion. I note, as Mr. Allen pointed out, that initially the emphasis in submissions was very heavily on reverse sensitivity. The evidence presented at the hearing session yesterday was certainly more focused on public health and wellbeing issues and the need to manage that. I expressed concerns in my evidence in chief rebuttal, and my summary as well about the robustness of the section 32 and the assessment material provided by NZTA or by the submitter. I also note that Kiwi Rail have not provided any similar such assessment, but appear to be relying on what has been submitted by other parties. I've listened to the responses yesterday from Mr. Wood in respect of my concerns about the robustness of the assessment, and he noted that it was no less robust than what you would expect for a district plan review and analysis of provisions proposed. I think here my concern is that it's the scale and nature of the extent of change that is being sought by the parties in their relief. At the risk of being blunt, this isn't a situation where building coverage or site coverage is being rolled over in a district plan review and we're considering a 5% increase, for example, and what the implications are of that. This is a significant change from what was notified. I note some GIS analysis has been done that was provided by Mr. Grala the other day, I recall. Our Becker team has also had a look at that. As usual, we've come up with a slightly different number, and we're happy to share the background. But we have, for the rail corridor alone, Becker estimate, our GIS team, that 100-metre corridor covers an area of 1,780 hectares. It's 1,780 through the district, and affects approximately 3,140 land parcels. So that's not dwellings, it's land parcels.
how many? 3,000?
3,140 land parcels. So that's not dwellings, just to be, or buildings, to be clear. So it's in that context that I've thought carefully about the Section 32 analysis and the clear directive in Section 32 and 32AA to provide a level of detail that corresponds to the scale and significance of the effects that may arise from the proposal. And I remain of the view that that Section 32 work that has been completed provides more guidance, but given the scale of the issue, does not provide me with sufficient, I guess, comfort to conclude that the controls as sought are indeed appropriate. And I just want to give you a couple of quick examples, and I'm sorry I'm coming to you with problems today rather than solutions, but I just thought this may provide some guidance. One of the key observations I had listening to the hearing the other day was that a lot of the responses from the parties were related to greenfields development. These are an appropriate solution in a greenfields environment. What I didn't hear a lot of yesterday was discussion about the existing environment and those existing urban settlements within the Waikato in terms of the controls, and particularly those which are seeking the outdoor noise levels, the acoustic barriers as an option pathway to compliance as necessarily being appropriate. And it got me thinking in terms of this issue and the assessment of under a Section 32 AA type scenario is whether a more robust way would be to do a greenfields scenario and an existing urban environment scenario. Because I think when you compare the effectiveness and efficiency of the controls that are proposed, you may come up with different answers. Greenfields, obviously converting land from rural to urban in line with a council structure plan, etc. It's quite a different process. You've got the developer involved, you've got the infrastructure providers involved. There's a lot more dialogue around the table in terms of planning for mounds, acoustic barriers, incorporate those with stormwater reserves, with cycleways, etc. The developer will then work through his feasibility on all those issues, and obviously, hopefully you can reach agreement. But when we're dealing with an existing urban environment where the two, rail or road, have coexisted side by side for 50 years or longer, I think that's when some of the controls, particularly the ones that were sought, which I think Mr. Mackey has rejected in his 42A rebuttal, I think those do create more confusion and a cost to the community. And what I haven't seen, and I didn't see it in the material presented yesterday, is there are benefits purported to accrue to the community as a result of these controls. What would help round that assessment out would be what the utility providers are also doing on their part to assist in mitigating the effects of those operations, be it details on a programmed rollout of upgrades for acoustic barriers or track upgrades. So then there's a more cohesive picture of the effects, the costs of the effects, which I still don't think have been quantified satisfactorily, and also the apportionment of costs to the parties. And I'm not saying it needs to be a precise science, but I think there is currently a gap in the ledger on a balanced apportionment of cost, because the cost is something that the community will wear in order to achieve a purported benefit. But at the moment, the community is wearing all the costs the way the rules are structured. And it would be interesting to see what the agencies have in the way of their programs and their upgrades and their financial commitments to round that assessment out. And that's really my really it in a nutshell as to my position at the moment based on the information I've heard. I appreciate that may not be the most helpful advice, but hopefully it sets the scene for my concerns about what we've heard to date. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Kearney. Do you have any questions?
What do you mean? Okay. Yeah, just one there. You mentioned about considering this as a two-prong approach, one for greenfields and one for existing development. With the greenfields, we take that example. You don't need to be too prescriptive, do you? Because a subdivision, for example, in a greenfield area is a restricted discretionary status. So as part of that criteria, wouldn't you put in a criteria that simply says have regard to acoustic mitigation? You guys can word it better than I can, but something like that. So you don't need your 100 meters. You just got to have a discretion to say, well, you got to have regard to this criteria. You're right next to a railway line. Council's going to say, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, that's a pretty straightforward approach, isn't it?
Look, and in the interests of keeping it simple, absolutely right. As long as those matters of discretion covered and ensured that whatever was envisaged further into the development in the way of housing was able to proceed, knowing that they would achieve a certain level of acoustic benefit from that, then that may be one way of looking at that. Now, how that's triggered into the plan would be something that would probably need to be discussed with the planning team at the council. But I think as to provide guidance for greenfields, then absolutely that'd be a good starting point.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gibb, any questions?
No questions, but just on what you've just said, Commissioner Cooney, if they open the window, it won't make any difference from what we heard before. So yeah, it is hard to get a balance. Yeah.
And I think particularly one of the issues just on that does come in, and I think Mr. Stiles touched on it too, was the single story dwelling and building timber frame single story dwelling. There was some discussion in the acoustic memorandum attached to the section 32AA from the submitters, which did also flag that if a second story was added, there may be additional acoustic work required. So I guess in the context of what Mr. Cooney asked me, my response was as long as the development that went subsequent to those mitigation measures being put in place between the parties actually made provision for whatever type of development was going to take place. And if it's a two-level dwelling, if there's a way that the mitigation can cover that scenario, that would need to be looked at.
Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fulton?
No, thank you. I think probably what this has done and what you have done here is highlighted and raised a large number of questions that now need to be further answered, because it's not clear to me anywhere now that we're anywhere near an answer. And I think the work as suggested by the chair before, it's probably going to be the way we're going to have to go to try and come to some common ground here, because there's a huge gap here between what we're being heard from NZTA and the rail and where you're coming from. So thank you very much.
Well, my apologies. We couldn't edge you towards a solution, but hopefully there was some nuggets in there for you to consider.
It certainly has been.
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Stickney.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That is Kāinga case. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen.
Just before, yeah, me again.
Hello again.
Before you go, and I should have asked Mr. Stickney this, and he raised it, and I think it's an interesting point. He said that there's been a move away from the reverse sensitivity approach originally promoted by NZTA to one of, look, it's out of concern for health issues. And that, when you start to think that through, that's not a reverse sensitivity issue in the strict sense. It's really saying we are asking, we are making noise levels that may affect people if they are living close to road or rail, and therefore something should be done about it. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yes, sir. Our reading of the submission and the material at the earlier stages was that the focus was on reverse sensitivity. That is, that the presence of people near to the transport corridors would produce complaints as a consequence of the noise generated by those corridors, and that would then impact adversely on what the corridor user could do. The evidence, as we looked at it, didn't really raise that issue in quite the same focus as it had been in the submission. But I think yesterday's discussion made that clearer again, because when there was questioning from the panel about complaints, which of course is a component in reverse sensitivity, that issue tended to fall away. And we were then left, and I think Dr. Childs was one in particular who focused on the health and safety issues. And we accept that obviously when noise is such that it creates those effects, you've got to address it. As I said earlier, we're not sure that we're there in terms of proving it in this district in these circumstances. That's one of the issues. Okay. But that is a very different approach to an issue and a very different way of viewing the problem. And we would say it also does direct you to view the solution differently. So in reverse sensitivity, you do put pressure on the sensitive activity in a sense. That is the activity that needs to modify itself or doesn't happen or has covenants or whatever to avoid that reverse sensitivity effect arising. When you're dealing with a direct effect from an activity on other sensitive activities, the first place you look to resolve those concerns will be the activity that's creating the effect, which in this case is the infrastructure. So there are things that can be done, and obviously Mr. Stiles has mentioned the effect, the significant effect of making sure you don't have potholes in roads in terms of noise and in terms of particularly vibration. So that's where you'd look first. And then I think you get into the discussion that we were having earlier about to what extent does the infrastructural party start providing ways of mitigating the effects. And that might be something like the Auckland Airport does, where you help fund the mitigation works. And so I think moving, there's a fundamental difference between reverse sensitivity and a direct effect. And there's a fundamental difference, I think, in terms of where you look for the solution in the first instance.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, sir. That's okay. So thank you very much again for your time and patience with us.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the submitters that have requested to be heard. What I suggest that we do, we've give Mr. Mackey the right to make a reply in relation to what he's heard during the course of the hearing, and we asked a couple of questions that he said he'd come back to us on. I think it's probably most appropriate that we take a break now for, should we say, half an hour, and come back at 1:30 when we'll hear from Mr. Mackey, and then the panel will adjourn and we'll figure out where we might go from here. So if the panel wouldn't mind holding fire just for a couple of minutes, but if everybody else could log off, we'll resume again at 1:30, please, on a separate link for which there have been instructions issued to people. So thank you, we're now adjourned.